Chapter 3170. The formation of small group was the result of multiple individuals with similar interests. In other words, it was obvious that there was a huge difference in interest between different groups. And among those 4 and 6 tribulation experts, there were tens of thousands of small groups. With so many small groups, each of them represented a kind of interest, a direction to work towards, and a direction to pursue. In this way, it was easy to imagine how messy the whole would be after they gathered together. Because of this, although this group was the largest among the 3, its overall power was the weakest among the 3. After that, it was the entire latent consciousness of the transcendent. In terms of size, the collective consciousness of the transcendent experts was much weaker than the collective consciousness of the 4 and 6 tribulation experts. But in terms of quality, it was much stronger than the collective consciousness of the 4 and 6 tribulation experts. After all, compared to the scattered collective consciousness of the 4 and 6 tribulation experts, the collective consciousness of the transcendent experts was more or less the same. This kind of general interest demand united all of their consciousnesses together, causing everyone's consciousness to be twisted into a rope. This naturally made their quality far stronger than the overall potential consciousness of the 4 and 6 tribulation expert. Compared to this as the smallest one, Luo Fan's consciousness was far superior in quality to the other 2. After all, although the collective consciousness of the transcendent experts was twisted into a rope, it was still not a whole. Instead, it was a collective of countless individuals. No matter how similar the interests of such existences were, it was impossible for them to be completely the same. And if their interests were not completely the same, there would inevitably be some scattered conflicts among them. Although these scattered conflicts were only an insignificant part of the whole, they would still affect the quality of the whole. Under this influence, even if Luo Fan was only a 6 tribulation expert, the quality of his consciousness would still be much higher than that of the whole. Not to mention the fact that Luo Fan was not merely a 6 tribulation cultivator. His cultivation had already reached the peak of a 7th tribulation cultivator. He had reached the level where he was only a small step away from the 8th tribulation expert. Under such circumstances, it went without saying that the quality of his consciousness projection was very high. Naturally, it was far superior to the other 2 parts. However, although it was superior to the other 2 parts in terms of quality, there was still a gap between its volume and the other 2 parts. Moreover, the demands of the endless heaven and earth also determined that the position of his consciousness in the endless heaven and earth could not surpass the overall potential consciousness of the transcendent being. Therefore, his position was naturally much lower than the overall consciousness of the person who had transcended the world. Of course, compared to the 6 tribulation experts' overall consciousness, it was stronger. This was to be expected. After all, the entire latent consciousness of 6 tribulation expert was only external. No matter what, it was just an external object to this endless world. As a reflection of the origin, it was impossible for it to be inferior to external objects. Moreover, the relationship between the 3 did not exist side by side. In fact, apart from Luo Fan's consciousness being suppressed, the relationship between the other 2 was that one of them was transforming into the other. At this time, the overall latent consciousness of the person who had transcended the world was devouring the entire latent consciousness of the 6 tribulation expert bit by bit like it was absorbing nutrients. During this absorption process, the overall latent consciousness of the 6 tribulation expert began to slowly transform into the overall latent consciousness of the transcendent being. It looked as if the smoke was constantly being absorbed by the tree during this process to strengthen the tree. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because those 6 tribulation experts were rapidly transforming into transcendence in this boundless world. After transforming into the transcendent being, the overall latent consciousness of the 6 tribulation expert would naturally gradually merge into the overall latent consciousness of the person who had transcended the world, becoming a part of the overall latent consciousness of the person who had transcended the world. According to this trend, one day, The overall latent consciousness of the sixth tribulation expert would eventually be completely transformed into the overall latent consciousness of the person who had transcended the world. At that time, the projection of Luo Fan's consciousness would probably be even more squeezed out of shape. However, Luo Fan was happy to see this development. As mentioned before, he had built the island in the first place, and even allowed it to develop into its current form, with countless islands branching off and turning into an endless world, all for his own cultivation on the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. But it was not for the authority of this endless world, nor was it for power. Under such circumstances, not to mention that his consciousness projection was only being suppressed, even if it was completely destroyed, as long as it didn't affect his ability to sense the grand exchange between the endless world and the ocean of nothingness outside, as long as it didn't affect the benefits he obtained from this exchange and the advancement of his cultivation realm, then everything would naturally be fine. Obviously, as long as the endless world did not completely change its nature, the exchange would not completely disappear. As the creator of this endless world, his perception of the endless world would not disappear. The process of benefiting from that exchange would not be interrupted. In this way, he naturally did not care how the other two parts evolved, nor did he care to how much his consciousness would be squeezed by the other two parts. After the sixth tribulation experts entered the many island branches, it looked from the outside that the island branches were clear. More than 99% of the figures that were originally densely packed around the island branches had disappeared. Although there were still a small number of sixth tribulation powerhouses who stayed outside, they were either observing, looking for opportunities, hesitating, or simply not having the time. In short, they stayed around these branches of the islands. They stayed here, making the island branches look livelier than many other places of cultivation. But the degree of liveliness had become quite limited. At least, if one just glanced at it from a distance, he would not notice it at first glance because of the situation here. After all, although the number of sixth tribulation experts around this island branch was quite lively, if one expanded the view to the countless cultivation places and opportunities on the sixth floor of the Tao Master's Road, it would not seem so special. In this way, how could those extremely busy sixth tribulation experts notice this island branch at first glance among the countless places to choose from? For the time being, because so many sixth tribulation experts had been here before, these island branches would still attract a considerable number of sixth tribulation experts' attention. However, as time went by, as the time for those sixth tribulation experts to come here got longer and longer, these memory imprints would naturally become more and more blurred. In the end, except for those sixth tribulation experts who sent their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections to the island branches, or the sixth tribulation experts in the endless world, it was impossible for many sixth tribulation experts to notice this special place. Under such circumstances, the place formed by the countless heaven and earth phantom shadows that ran through the countless nothingness ocean layer began to attract the attention of the sixth tribulation experts little by little. Gradually, it seemed to have returned to its original state. This place was the most noteworthy place in the entire sixth floor of the Tao Master's Road. Of course, this was only on the surface. In any case, the number of sixth tribulation experts who sent their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections to the endless world was beyond imagination. Even their attention alone was enough to occupy the mainstream of all the sixth tribulation experts in the entire sixth floor of the Tao Master's Road. In other words, no matter on the surface, the heaven and earth phantom shadows had become the center of attention of the entire sixth floor of the Tao Master's Road, as long as the doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections of the sixth tribulation experts in the endless world did not leave. The center of attention was definitely the island branch. Although the endless world had grown from nothing, from an island with hundreds of space-times to billions of worlds now, the change was so great that it was unimaginable. Saying that the world had changed was just an extremely conservative way of saying that it was a sea turning into mulberry fields. However, because the time flow of the island was set to be countless times faster than that of the outside world, the whole process of change was only a very short period of time compared to the outside world. How short was it? It was so short that at this time, the heaven and earth phantom shadows had only just begun the third evaluation. Don't forget, in the heaven and earth phantom shadows, the flow of time was also greatly accelerated. Although the acceleration was not as much as the endless world, it was still an accelerated state. After all, it was in a state that was many times faster than the outside world. Even so, it was only the third evaluation so far, which was enough to show how short this period of time was. Compared with the first evaluation at the beginning, the benefits that Luo Fan could give to the high-ranking cultivators had become more and more. After all, the benefits that he needed to give to those cultivators was to display the mysteries that were suitable for those cultivators' cultivation. With the help of such a display, those cultivators could obtain the mysteries that were most suitable for them. And by relying on the mysteries of cultivation, the cultivator's cultivation realm would be improved. It could be said that such benefits completely depended on the support of Luo Fan's cultivation foundation. Without other supplements, even with Luo Fan's cultivation realm at the peak of the seventh tribulation, he would not be able to display it more than a few times. After all, the mysteries of cultivation that he needed to display were the mysteries of the six tribulation powerhouses no matter what. In terms of strength, the six tribulation powerhouses naturally could not be compared to him at all. They almost did not even have the qualifications to make him take action. However, in terms of cultivation realm, the six tribulation powerhouses and him were ultimately only one realm apart. No matter how great the gap between this realm was, it was still only one realm. Relying on his high perspective, he could deduce the mysteries of cultivation that any six tribulation powerhouse needed to improve their cultivation realm through various traces. However, such deductions were obviously not infinite. As the number of times increased, such deductions would become more and more powerless. In the end, it would reach the point where he could no longer deduce anything. Once that happened, the attraction that Luo Fan had set up in the heaven and earth phantom shadows for those six tribulation powerhouses would naturally disappear completely. At that time, those six tribulation powerhouses would definitely abandon the heaven and earth phantom shadows. However, it was clear that Luo Fan was not just relying on his own foundation at this time. Don't forget that he still had his main body at this time, as well as the clone in the endless world in the branch of the island. His main body had fused with his own heavens, and he was constantly experiencing the communication between his heavens and the endless ocean of nothingness outside. Although this communication was deep and obscure, making it difficult for him to see through it, it was still a form of communication after all. In the process of communication, there were still gains, and these gains were enough to transform into his foundation, allowing him to deduce the mysteries of the six tribulation powerhouses many times. In addition, his clone in the branch of the island, or rather, the clone in the endless world, could also sense that kind of communication. However, because the branch of the island was not the heavens, this kind of communication was still extremely grand, but it was still a layer away from the communication between the heavens and the ocean of nothingness. However, because the branch of the island was not the heavens, although this kind of communication was also extremely grand, it was still a layer away from the communication between the heavens and the ocean of nothingness. With such a layer separating them, the profoundness of the communication was naturally weakened. Since the profoundness was weakened, the degree of obscurity was naturally weakened at the same time. In this way, the benefits that Luo Fan could obtain from the communication between the endless world and the ocean of nothingness were much greater than the communication between the heavens and the ocean of nothingness. In this way, the foundation that he could strengthen through this kind of communication was naturally much stronger than the foundation that he could obtain through the communication between the heavens and the ocean of nothingness. Although there were these two kinds of supplements, the real focus was still on the latter. Moreover, to a certain extent, the strengthening of the foundation and the deduction of the mysteries of the cultivation of the six tribulation powerhouses in the heaven and earth phantom shadows complemented each other. By relying on this kind of deduction, he could conduct a preliminary sorting out of the foundation, allowing him to stimulate more of the foundation and turn it into motivation to improve his cultivation realm. Post-air, share. Chapter 3171. This kind of complementary effect was something that Luo Fan had not expected in advance. However, it was precisely because of this complementary effect that the benefits he obtained from the world of Law Phantom and the Endless World were much more than he had expected. Moreover, the time that these two could last was much longer than before. Time passed little by little. Unknowingly, 100 years had passed. For the existence of the six tribulation experts, 100 years was like a blink of an eye. It was just a difference in terms of names. In the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, the main body was the six tribulation experts. Therefore, in the sixth level of the Tao Master's Road, 100 years naturally seemed to be quite short. For the ordinary six tribulation experts, 100 years was equivalent to them adjusting their breathing, cultivating, or even taking a nap. It was no different from the countless years before. However, for some six tribulation experts, this 100 years had a completely different meaning. This group of six tribulation experts were none other than the six tribulation experts who had incarnations, clones, projections, and other similar existences that were sent into the illusory world of laws, or those six tribulation experts who also had such existences sent into the island branch or the endless world. The flow of time in the countless world of Law Phantom was many times faster than the outside world. In every 1,000 years, the doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections sent into the world of Law Phantom would bring them some benefits, allowing them to have a deeper understanding of the mysteries of cultivation that were compatible with their own Tao of cultivation. Under such circumstances, the number of times they received such feedback in 100 years would probably be counted in the thousands or tens of thousands of times. And every time they received feedback, their cultivation would grow to a certain extent. The degree of growth was something that could only be obtained after hundreds of millions of years, or even billions of years. Under such circumstances, how could they treat this 100 years as a nap time? This was the case for the six tribulation experts who had sent their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections into the world of Law Phantom. For the six tribulation experts who had sent their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections into the endless world, the situation would only be more obvious. After all, even though the flow of time in that world was extremely swift, it was at most equivalent to taking a single breath to be countless tens of thousands of years in the outside world. However, in that boundless world, the flow of time was so fast that a single breath in the outside world was equivalent to billions of years inside. For the doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections of the six tribulation experts, 100 years in the outside world was perhaps only a few 100 million years. Only such a long time could allow each of them to obtain the reward of being ranked first so many times. For the doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections of the six tribulation powerhouses in the endless world, even if it was measured in billions of years, it was still an unimaginably astronomical number. Under such circumstances, how could this period of time be like the past 100 years to the doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections of level 6 experts? Even though it wasn't the true bodies of those level 6 powerhouses who experienced this personally. After all, every once in a while, the endless world would open up some connection time, allowing them to communicate deeply with their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections. Under such circumstances, they would naturally be able to clearly feel what those doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections had experienced and obtained in the endless world every once in a while. In this way, it was self-evident how long the past 100 years were in their eyes. And during this 100 years, although Luo Fan had gained something from the world of Law Phantom, it wasn't too great. After all, there were too many variables in that function. Even after more than 100 years, and countless six tribulation experts had been tossing and turning in the world of Law Phantom at the same time, there was still a huge gap between the data obtained and determining all the variables. Of course, although the progress wasn't great, there was still progress. At the very least, through such progress, he clearly knew that there was no problem with his approach. If he continued like this, he would indeed be able to obtain the function he wanted. On the other hand, his gains in the boundless world were completely different. After 100 years in the outside world and billions of years of development in the endless world, the situation in the endless world was already extremely different from before. At this moment, in the boundless world, there was no longer any difference between a sixth tribulation expert from the outside and a transcendent expert from within. After a long period of evolution, all the six tribulation experts had already become transcendent experts and completely integrated into the endless world. Because of this change, the endless world's volume had increased by at least 100 million times compared to 100 years ago. After all, there were simply too many six tribulation experts from the outside. Even if they only became transcendent experts and didn't do anything afterwards, it would be enough to increase the number of worlds in the endless world by trillions. Not to mention, it was impossible for the six tribulation experts to do nothing and enjoy the benefits brought by the change in status after becoming transcendent experts. They would definitely work hard to increase the benefits they could obtain in the endless world through various means. Obviously, the most effective means they used was to help the island branches grow, or in other words, to help the endless world grow. 100 years in the outside world was billions and trillions of years in this endless world. During this period of time, even if they only opened up a world every 100 million years, the number of them was enough to make the endless world grow thousands of times. Not to mention that after they knew how to increase the benefits they obtained, they almost constantly opened up the world and helped the endless world to grow. In this way, it was not strange at all that the endless world expanded by hundreds of millions of times during this period of time. And with this change, the endless world, or the island branches, gradually began to become the focus of all the six tribulation experts on the sixth floor of the Tao Master's path. The reason was actually quite simple. That was because the expansion of this boundless world wasn't without any signs. And the signs were the number of island branches. The number of worlds in the endless world had increased by so much, it was conceivable how many island branches had increased. It might be much less than the increase of the world, but it was still an incredibly terrifying number. And in what form were these island branches distributed in the sixth floor of the Tao Master's path? They existed in a state where each island branch entered a layer of the ocean of nothingness. In this case, the increase of the island branches was equivalent to the increase of the ocean of nothingness occupied by the island branches as a whole. Because the perspective of the six tribulation experts was not broad enough, the number of island branches occupying the ocean of nothingness at the beginning was beyond imagination, and in this respect, they would not attract too much attention from the six tribulation experts. This was like a starry sky universe. Under normal circumstances, intelligent beings on a certain planet could only see a corner of this starry sky universe. Even if they felt that the starry sky universe was mysterious and unfathomable, they would not have a clear concept of the size of this starry sky universe. Perhaps they would find out through various means that the starry sky universe was very, very big, but they would not think too much about how big it was and what this vast starry sky universe represented. However, one day, when the vastness of the starry sky universe finally surpassed a certain limit, causing the entire starry sky universe to display an unbelievable scene that defied the worldview of ordinary living beings. Only then would those intelligent living beings slowly understand how vast the starry sky universe was and what it represented. This kind of situation was actually the same for a sixth tribulation expert. Before, for example, 100 years ago, although they felt that the number of ocean layers connected by the island branches was extremely large, they only felt that the existence behind the island branches was different from others. They did not really think that this situation was significant, and they did not think that it was necessary for them to pay much attention to it. However, after 100 years, as the number of ocean layers connected by the island branches increased to an incredible level, it finally caused all kinds of special changes in the ocean of nothingness. They finally realized how extraordinary this situation was and what kind of unimaginable changes this kind of connection could bring. In this way, they would finally really pay attention to these island branches. Therefore, after 100 years, the number of six tribulation experts around the island branches began to increase again, gradually making this place the center of attention of the entire sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. The special changes caused by the increase of the ocean layers connected by the island branches to a certain extent were actually not too complicated to explain. It was that these island branches gradually began to project above the ocean layer of nothingness. That is, above the entire ocean of nothingness. In the eyes of all the six tribulation experts, the ocean layer of nothingness really existed. But in fact, this was only because they had a very deep understanding of the ocean of nothingness. In fact, if ordinary creatures saw the ocean of nothingness at this time, they would not be able to see any ocean layers at all. What they would see would only be a boundless ocean of nothingness. For example, when ordinary cultivators saw the state of chaos, they would not be able to see the countless layers of chaos hidden in it. Instead, they would only see the entire chaotic state of chaos, which seemed to have everything, but also seemed to have nothing. Previously, even if the island branches had connected countless layers of nothingness, the layers of nothingness that they connected were absolutely insignificant compared to the layers of nothingness it contained in the entire ocean of nothingness. Therefore, there was no way to see its existence from the entire ocean of nothingness. In other words, even if there was a huge foundation in the ocean layer of nothingness, in the eyes of ordinary creatures, it did not exist. But now the situation had changed, because the number of layers connected by the island had increased to a level that could cause a qualitative change. The island branches that originally did not exist in the eyes of ordinary creatures finally had a form in the entire ocean of nothingness. Although what emerged at this time was only the shadow of an island, even compared to the heavens that were born from the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, it was like a phantom. But after all, it was no longer a void. This was simply equivalent to breaking the boundary between existence and nothingness. Previously, no matter how many of these island branches there were, no matter how wonderful their interior was, they were all zero on the surface of the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path. And now it was no longer zero. It had become 0.0001. Although it seemed to be no different from zero in essence, it was something after all, not nothing. Any six tribulation powerhouse would be able to clearly understand the significance of such a qualitative change. Hence, they had no choice but to pay attention to the existence of this island branch. Hence, they had no choice but to shift their focus from other places to this island branch. It was also because of this that such a change occurred, causing the surroundings of the island to once again become lively. On the surface of the ocean of nothingness, the island phantom projected by the countless island branches was not the appearance of any island branch. Instead, it was the appearance of a complete island. On the surface, it did not seem to be much different from the island before the branch. But if one looked closely, they would find that the number of overlapping images was countless times more than before. When they first saw the island, they could still distinguish the scale of the overlapping images, even if they could not clearly count it. But now, looking at the island phantom, they could not distinguish the scale of the overlapping effects at all. It felt like the overlapping effects were like the shadow of this island. It looked like the island was surrounded by some pitch-black smoke, and it was surging little by little with the passage of time. Chapter 3172. An existence similar to a projection had appeared above the complete sea of nothingness. Such a situation had never occurred in a natural landscape of the land of cultivation. For a long time, only the heavens corresponding to the six tribulation experts had appeared above the complete void ocean at the sixth level of the road to Tao Master. Apart from the heavens, everything else, no matter how mysterious, incredible, or mysterious it was, only existed in a certain layer of the void ocean. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how shocked the six tribulation experts were when the projection of the island branch appeared above the complete void ocean. With such a shock, they naturally shifted their attention to the branch of the island. Naturally, this branch of the island gradually became lively again. Moreover, because of the different reasons, the attitude of the six tribulation experts who gathered here now towards the island branch was greatly different from that of the six tribulation experts 100 years ago. The six tribulation experts had noticed that the island branch had changed from an artificial object to a natural object, so they wanted to explore its mysteries, figure out its secrets, and even find a way to replicate it. Under such a mentality, the island branch in front of them felt more like a kind of experiment or a kind of research sample. In this way, it went without saying that their attitude toward the island branch in front of them was, of course, a kind of enthusiasm, almost a kind of attitude of looking down on the island branch. However, at this time, the six tribulation experts were obviously completely different. At this time, they had achieved incomprehensible and incredible achievements because the island branch had achieved some incomprehensible and incredible achievements in some way that they could not understand. Under such circumstances, how could they still have the attitude of looking down on the island branch in front of them like those six tribulation experts? Even prostrating and worshiping him was too slow. At this moment, they no longer had the slightest confidence in facing the island branch in front of them. In their hearts, they no longer had the mentality of studying its mysteries, but a mentality of admiration, a mentality that they would be satisfied as long as they could get a little benefit from it. With this mentality, they naturally didn't dare to be careless towards the island branches in front of them like the previous batch of six tribulation powerhouses. Instead, they were extremely careful and cautious, afraid that their actions would trigger some mechanism that would bring them an unbearable disaster. Even though they were only clones, incarnations, and projections, they couldn't change their mentality. Even though exploring dangerous places with such beings could guarantee their safety to a certain extent, it was apparent that it wasn't enough against this island branch. In other words, they weren't confident that the punishment from the island's branch could be blocked by the separation. When those six tribulation experts became cautious, they naturally had various ways to increase their understanding of the island branch before they entered it. As for what method it was naturally something that didn't need to be said. Any six tribulation powerhouse could be said to have reached an unimaginable height on their own cultivation path. Once one reached a certain height in the path of cultivation, one's abilities and might would reach an unimaginable level. In this way, the various exploration methods they used couldn't be expressed in simple words. It could be said that if the methods used by any six tribulation powerhouse were to be described, it would probably be enough to become a great masterpiece. At this time, how many six tribulation powerhouses were there around these countless island branches? It was also a number calculated in the hundreds of millions. This number was naturally insignificant compared to the number of six tribulation powerhouses who directly entered the island branch or the endless world 100 years ago. But in terms of absolute numbers, it was still an extremely huge number. It was almost unimaginable how big of a project it was to clearly express the methods used by so many six tribulation powerhouses. Therefore, at this time, it could only be said that these six tribulation powerhouses were using various methods that belonged to them to explore those island branches. Their cautious exploration had an impact on the branch of the island that was many times greater than the exploration of the branch of the island by the six tribulation powerhouses. After all, different mentalities meant different levels of exploration, and the exploration methods used were naturally different. Different exploration methods would naturally affect the branch of the island completely differently. If it was the original island branches, the original endless world would definitely be unable to maintain stability in the face of countless six tribulation powerhouses' various unimaginable exploration methods. Perhaps some of the island branches would directly change their nature, and it was even possible for them to collapse further. Of course, at that time, there was Luo Fan guarding this island branch, so there was no need to worry that things would develop to this point. Of course, if it really reached the point where Luo Fan had to take action, then the exploration process of these six tribulation powerhouses wouldn't be so smooth. However, it was clear that the current situation was completely different from before. Now, this island branch, or rather this endless world, was completely incomparable to before, whether it was in terms of size, the structure of the world itself, or quality. Now, in the face of these exploration methods that could shake and even change the nature of the island branches and ultimately cause the island branches to collapse, these island branches were as stable as before. Any method that could affect the stability of the island branches was just like a river entering the sea and didn't cause any other changes at all. Whether it was the island branches themselves or the world within, there were no signs of instability because of these various unimaginable exploration methods. This change made those 6 tribulation powerhouses even more shocked. They naturally knew how dangerous their exploration methods were. If they explored alone, this risk was still controllable. They could completely adjust their own exploration methods according to the feedback caused by the exploration and adjust the degree of impact on the island branches and the world within. But now, there were countless 6 tribulation powerhouses exploring these island branches at the same time. So many 6 tribulation powerhouses, even if they were around different island branches, seemed to be separated by the void layer and didn't have much contact with each other. But in fact, because the core belonged to the endless world, their exploration methods would eventually affect each other. Under the interaction of various methods, their exploration methods would eventually break away from their absolute control. In this way, the destructive power of their exploration methods was almost unreservedly unleashed on those island branches without any restrictions. Just thinking about the extent of such destruction made those 6 tribulation powerhouses' hair stand on end. However, this kind of destruction actually didn't cause any reaction from the island branches. The island branches still looked the same as before, and there was no trace of abnormality at all. It was as if the exploration methods that they had thrown in weren't the various exploration methods that could cause tragic destruction, but rather some very ordinary light, shadow, waves, aura, sound, divine ability, power, mind, perception. Well, this situation made these 6 tribulation powerhouses even more cautious of those island branches. And after their exploration methods caused uncontrollable consequences, it wasn't like they didn't gain anything. In fact, the harvest was so great that those 6 tribulation powerhouses were secretly surprised. In fact, it was also because of these gains that they knew how incredible it was that the island branches didn't change at all. Through the feedback of countless exploration methods, they already clearly knew that the island branches seemed to be separated on the surface, but the core was actually the same. The world inside them was incomparably closely connected and was a complete whole. Different 6 tribulation powerhouses naturally explored from different angles. If they treated their own exploration results as a secret and didn't communicate with others, then the understanding of the island branches that they ultimately established would obviously only be an extremely one-sided understanding. These 6 tribulation powerhouses were quite clear on this point. Therefore, the communication between these 6 tribulation powerhouses was much more than the previous few exploration batches of 6 tribulation powerhouses. And it was a lot more. And as the communication increased, they naturally needed a place where everyone could gather. This way, some cities, islands, and continents began to unknowingly appear around the island branches. Under this kind of change, these island branches seemed to have turned into stars, gradually capturing matter and condensing into planets around themselves. This kind of change happened naturally. By the time everyone reacted, it was already too late to change. The flow of time inside is billions of times faster than outside. Why would there be such an abnormal time zone on the 6th level? In a void city around a certain island branch, a 6 tribulation powerhouse sighed towards his companions, as well as other 6 tribulation powerhouses. With a city, there were naturally all sorts of necessary facilities in the city. Of course, because everyone here was a 6 tribulation powerhouse. Although the functions of the facilities were similar to those of ordinary cities, their performance was naturally completely different. For example, although the place where these 6 tribulation powerhouses were was called a restaurant, it actually didn't look like an ordinary restaurant at all. What was sold here wasn't even wine, but some kind of special intent that could produce a substance similar to wine. In other words, drinking here wasn't actually wine, but some kind of existence similar to the god of wine. It was some kind of intent that could produce a corresponding effect on 6 tribulation powerhouses. For the 6 tribulation powerhouses who were drinking here, what they enjoyed here was just that kind of intent. Of course, different 6 tribulation powerhouses naturally had different degrees of acceptance towards this kind of intent. Some could completely immerse themselves in that kind of intent, while others could barely be affected by it. As for the specifics, it depended on their respective Tao of cultivation, as well as the Tao of cultivation of the existence that provided these intents. The complexity of this was actually similar to the complexity of the relationship between wine and guests in the secular world. In the secular world, there are also people who could drink a lot, while others could not. Some people loved wine as much as their lives, while others wanted to vomit at the smell of wine. Some wines were easy to brew, while others were difficult to brew. Some wines needed to be aged for years or decades, while some wines could be served on the table on the day they were cooked. There were all sorts of them, but they weren't much simpler than the relationship between the intent and the 6 tribulation powerhouses in this restaurant. Of course, just like how people in the secular world who went to drink had different purposes, the 6 tribulation powerhouses who came to this restaurant to drink naturally had different purposes. Some simply wanted to enjoy the intent or comprehend it. Some simply came here to communicate with other 6 tribulation powerhouses. In reality, the proportion of 6 tribulation powerhouses with different purposes was about the same. They didn't build this city for the purpose of communication, so the 6 tribulation powerhouses here were more for the purpose of communication. After all, different 6 tribulation powerhouses had different personalities. Even if their main purpose was to communicate, they would have different thoughts and habits. After all, this was only a restaurant. It was impossible for it to be a place that all 6 tribulation powerhouses liked to communicate. There were many 6 tribulation powerhouses who weren't willing to communicate in this kind of place, but wanted to enjoy the services provided in this place. With this flow of time, who knows how many trillions of years would pass for every breath we take. This is simply too unfriendly to us. Another 6 tribulation powerhouse sighed. After all, it wasn't born specifically for us. Why would it be friendly to us? Another 6 tribulation powerhouse said with a hint of unwillingness. Clearly, although he said that, he wasn't in a very good mood in the face of such unfriendly treatment. I wonder what benefits those fellow Taoists obtained. Another 6 tribulation powerhouse sighed. Chapter 31:73. Although they knew that they would spend trillions of years in the island branch for every breath they took outside, these 6 tribulation experts were not in a hurry. At least they were not in a hurry to the extent that they needed to spend billions of years in the island branch. After all, to these 6 tribulation experts, they had come here to obtain benefits from the island's branch, not to compete with anyone. Under such circumstances, as long as the benefits inside did not disappear, the result was satisfactory for them. Obviously, this island branch had existed for more than 100 years on the 6th floor of the Tao Master's Road. Compared to the time in the island's branch, this period of time was likely an astronomical number, even if it was calculated in billions of trillion years. Under such circumstances, if the benefits were related to time, they would naturally have disappeared long ago. Even if they seized all the time and entered at the fastest speed, they would obviously not be able to obtain those benefits. If the benefits were unrelated to time, then even if they wasted more time, even if they entered for hundreds of thousands of years, the benefits they could obtain would not be discounted. In this case, there was naturally no need to be anxious. Of course, they were not really so ambitious to prepare here for hundreds of thousands of years before entering. After all, although the benefits might not be related to time, the island branch was after all related to time. Who knew if the island branch would still exist after hundreds of thousands of years? If it was still there, then their benefits would naturally still be there. But what if it was not there? Of course, from a certain point of view, it was a bit groundless to shorten the duration of a natural landscape to hundreds of thousands of years. This was the 6th floor of the Tao Master's Road. How could a natural landscape that could exist here without a history of trillions of years? However, this was only for most natural landscapes. For most other natural landscapes, the situation was naturally like this, but for the island branch in front of them, this worry was obviously not groundless. It should be known that the speed of time inside these island branches was a terrifying speed that was equivalent to trillions of years in a breath. Under such circumstances for this island branch, hundreds of thousands of years in the outside world were actually equivalent to an astronomical number of trillions of years. In the end, was the history of this natural landscape calculated according to the time outside, or the time inside. In other words, whether the lifespan of this island depended on how much time had passed in the outside world or how much time had passed in the inside world was obviously uncertain. Those 6 tribulation experts were clearly aware of this. Therefore, they were naturally worried about whether this island branch would still exist after thousands of years. Therefore, although they had built many countries, cities, continents, islands, and even world around these islands, they had not been able to do so. However, he didn't plan to stay here for many years. Normally, even the most patient 6 tribulation experts would only be prepared to stay here for a few months. Most of them decided to stay here for a few days to gather information before entering the branches of the islands. In fact, it was precisely because their plan was so short that so many countries, cities, continents, islands, and even world appeared so quickly around these islands. After all, the more time they had, the more they naturally needed to use their collective wisdom, and of course, the more they needed to communicate. Another 6 tribulation expert sighed and said, "It's a pity that they all seem to be very busy and have no time to pay attention to those of us who don't have a deep relationship with them. Otherwise, we might be able to get some information from their true bodies." Although it was impossible for these 6 tribulation experts outside to know which clones, incarnations, and projections of the 6 tribulation experts had already entered the island branches, they still had a general idea of who they were. Under such circumstances, many of them naturally wanted to obtain information about the internal affairs of those island branches from the true bodies of those 6 tribulation experts. However, it was a pity that, although not everyone could obtain information about the internal affairs of those island branches from the true bodies of those 6 tribulation experts, those 6 tribulation experts definitely wouldn't. However, those 6 tribulation experts would definitely not stay outside of these islands for now. Those who had obtained the information long ago had already entered those island branches. Why would they still stay around and wait to exchange the information they had gathered with the other 6 tribulation experts? As a result, the 6 tribulation experts who were waiting to communicate with each other were unable to obtain information from the 6 tribulation experts who had already entered the true bodies of the 6 tribulation experts. Hearing his words, the other 6 tribulation experts sighed inwardly. Previously, they didn't know why the true bodies of those 6 tribulation experts couldn't be bothered to pay attention to them. After all, in their opinion, it was just a matter of a few words. Even if they didn't have much of a relationship, as long as they didn't have any deep hatred, ordinary cultivators shouldn't refuse to leave a bit of good karma. Why would they directly use being busy as an excuse to not even leave a bit of good karma? However, now that they had used their own detection methods to find out some of the internal affairs of those island branches, they had already completely understood the attitude of those 6 tribulation experts. The flow of time in the internal affairs of those island branches was so fast that trillions of years might have passed in the time it took to say a few words to them. Under such circumstances, talking to them and leaving a bit of good karma with them might have to pay the price of delaying trillions of years of cultivation of their clones, incarnations, and projections in that island branches. In this case, without any special relationship, how could they waste time to say a few words to them? Because of this, the current situation occurred, causing so many 6 tribulation experts who couldn't obtain information to increase. These 6 tribulation experts didn't stay in the restaurant for too long. Even those 6 tribulation experts who came here to enjoy the special artistic conception in the restaurant wouldn't stay here for too long. After all, although it wasn't urgent, they still knew that it was risky to spend too much time here. A few days wasn't too long. It was already quite rare for them to take time out of a few days to stay here and enjoy the artistic conception. How could they treat this place as their home like ordinary drunkards? As for the owner of the restaurant or the owners of the other fixed organizations in the city, they were completely different from them. They were the other incarnations of the six tribulation powerhouses who had already sent their clones, incarnations, and projections into the branch of the island. The purpose of their creation was to establish such a fixed shop in this city, but there was no other purpose. In this way, they were either like the six tribulation experts who had entered the island branches before, completely ignoring other people who they didn't know much about, or they had no contact with their clones, incarnations, and projections at all. They didn't know what their clones, incarnations, and projections had experienced in the island branches at all. In this case, for other six tribulation experts, their entry was similar to the six tribulation experts who had already sent their clones, incarnations, and projections into the island branches. In other words, only those who had a deep friendship with them could obtain information about the internal affairs of those island branches from them. For the vast majority of six tribulation powerhouses, their existences were nothing more than decorations. In fact, forming a relationship with them was one of the reasons why some six tribulation experts came to the various shops in these cities. Of course, it was still possible to form a relationship with them beforehand, but after they had sent their clones, incarnations, and projections into the island branches, it would obviously be difficult to form a relationship with them. It was precisely because of this that there were naturally very few six tribulation experts who placed all their hopes on forming a relationship with them in order to obtain information about the island branches. More six tribulation experts placed their hopes on exchanging information with other six tribulation experts. A six tribulation expert thought to himself after returning to his cave abode, "I'm afraid it'll be a waste of effort if I continue to wait. With so much information that I obtained before, I should be able to get some benefits." Thinking of this, he no longer hesitated. He immediately informed a few six tribulation powerhouses that he was on good terms with. Then, he directly left the city and rushed toward the place around the city, which was the branch of the island. Not long after, they had already arrived around the island branches and were about to rush in. At this moment, a few figures turned into light and came from afar. At the same time, voices could be heard, "Fellow Taoist, wait for me." The six tribulation expert was slightly taken aback. He turned his head and found that they were the six tribulation experts who were the closest to him. He knew that they had also made up their minds after receiving his message. In the many gathering places around the many island branches, there were countless cultivators like them. In fact, at every moment, there would be six tribulation experts who felt that the information they had gathered had already met the requirements and decided to directly enter the island branches in the layer of nothingness where they were located. Of course, at the same time, there were also a large number of six tribulation experts rushing towards the island branches in the layer of nothingness, joining the teams that were gathering information. This kind of leaving and joining gradually formed a balance, causing the number of six tribulation experts in the gathering places to gradually maintain a rather subtle amount. As more and more six tribulation powerhouses entered and left, more and more information about the island's branches gathered in these settlements. The information about all aspects of the island's branches also became more and more extensive. Among them, some information was necessary and would be of great help to them in obtaining benefits from the island branches. However, most of it was clearly not necessary. It was related to various things, and the other things in the island branches were formed randomly. Although it contained the mysteries of the world, the mysteries of the special structure of the world, and even the mysteries of many transcendence and other things that existed in the island branches, it had little to do with the benefits they could obtain. This information was quite wondrous and extremely profound, as if it could be analyzed to reveal endless mysteries, causing the world inside the island branches to become even more mysterious and complicated. As more and more information like this appeared, the secrets of the world inside the island branches were gradually hidden in a dense fog. The more information the six tribulation experts gathered, the more they felt that the information they had gathered was insufficient. Therefore, they naturally wanted to gather the information of the island branches even more urgently. And the more they gathered, the more they felt that the information was insufficient, thus forming a vicious cycle. In fact, if Luo Fan saw the information they had gathered, he would probably suspect that the information was pointing towards the island branches he had constructed. There were too many things in the endless world that seemed right, but were actually wrong. However, if he were to really read the information, his understanding of the endless heaven and earth would probably deepen as well. Perhaps he could even recover some of his authority in the endless world. It was a pity that Luo Fan was currently thinking about the grand exchange between the endless world and the ocean of nothingness. He had no interest in paying attention to the information the 6 tribulation experts in the outside world had gathered to explore the endless world. Naturally, he did not know about this. Of course, even if he knew about this, whether he would do it or not was actually a question mark. After all, obtaining the authority of the endless world was not his ultimate goal. To him, the only reason for the existence of authority was to allow him to adjust the endless world to develop in a direction that would bring him more benefits. And now, the endless world was already developing in a direction that would bring him more and more benefits even without his authority. Why would he still need to retain this authority? Therefore, it was very likely that even if he knew about this, he could not be bothered to spend time studying this information and use it to increase his authority in the endless world. Chapter 3174. The changes in the outside world had relatively little impact on the endless world. After all, compared to the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses in the endless world, the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses waiting outside and those who entered the endless world was insignificant. Furthermore, because the flow of time in the endless world was much faster than the outside world, even if there were 6 tribulation experts continuously entering the endless world from the outside world, the effects they caused would be easily digested by the passage of time. In this way, they naturally wouldn't affect the situation in the endless world. Since they couldn't affect the endless world would naturally affect them instead. The greatest impact was that they would be assimilated by the transcendent beings and eventually become new transcendent beings, insignificant strengthening the camp of the transcendent beings in the endless world after a long period of development. The path from the 4th tribulation to the 5th tribulation had already been found by the transcendent beings who were born and raised in the endless world. In other words, the realm of the transcendent beings in the endless world was no longer disconnected. It wouldn't be like before, where they would jump from the 4th tribulation to the 6th tribulation. Of course, the number of experts in each realm was still different from the natural development. The number of 6 tribulation powerhouses was calculated in trillions, and the number of the remaining experts was also calculated in trillions. In other words, the transcendent beings in the 6th tribulation realm, which should have been the least in number, were the most among all the tribulation realm powerhouses. In fact, they might even have the same number as all the other transcendent beings in the endless world. From this, it was clear that this cultivation structure was extremely abnormal. Currently, there were many 5th tribulation powerhouses among the transcendent beings in the endless world. There were millions of them. As for the 4th tribulation powerhouses, there were hundreds of millions of them. After that, the number of 3rd tribulation, 2nd tribulation, and tribulation initiation powerhouses increased progressively. At the tribulation initiation level, the number had to be calculated in trillions. In contrast, the number of transcendent beings in the lower realms, such as the Supreme Emperor, the Despairing Beings, and the False Saint transcendent beings, kept decreasing. At the False Sage level, there were only tens of millions of them. The reason for this was very simple. It was because cultivators of the False Sage, Despair Realm, and Supreme Emperor Realm would rarely try to transcend the world. After all, a tribulation would descend when one transcended the world. If one's foundation wasn't solid enough, and if one's strength wasn't strong enough, then the difficulty of overcoming the tribulation would obviously be quite shocking. Under such circumstances, those cultivators below the False Sage stage, and Despair stage cultivators didn't have absolute confidence. They didn't think that they could fight above their level. They didn't think that they were absolute geniuses, but it was very difficult for them to make up their minds to become a transcendent being. The lower one's cultivation level was, the more confidence one needed to have in making such a decision. As a result, the number of people who were willing to do so would naturally be fewer. As a result, the number of cultivators below the false sage stage who had transcended after transcending was the fewest. On the other hand, although the number of despaired cultivators who had transcended through the entire world was the highest, it was still far less than the number of transcended cultivators who had transcended through the entire world and become tribulation cultivators who had transcended through the entire world. It was precisely because of this that the number of natives who had transcended was like this. After countless years of development, all the transcendent beings in the endless world actually had an extremely deep understanding of the endless world. After all, the ones who had the highest authority in the endless world were the entire hidden consciousness of the endless world. Since it was the entire latent consciousness of these transcendent beings, the affinity between them and Luo Fan's consciousness was naturally not comparable to the affinity between them and Luo Fan's consciousness, nor was it comparable to the affinity between them and the countless wills of the world in this endless world. With this affinity, they could resonate with the entire hidden consciousness at certain times through certain special methods. Once this resonance was established, they would naturally be able to obtain a lot of information contained in the entire hidden consciousness. That was information about the endless world. In this way, as time passed, they would naturally be able to have a deeper understanding of this boundless world. And when this understanding was integrated, it was enough for them to know many things that they had not known before, or things that they knew but could not explain clearly, or things that they knew but were only vague. It was precisely because of this that almost all the transcendent beings in the endless world knew that once they found the path to the sixth tribulation, the endless world would undergo an unimaginable metamorphosis. This metamorphosis could overturn the entire situation of the endless world, and it could cause the endless world to develop into a completely different state. Perhaps it would become something greater, or perhaps it would become something akin to a calamity. As for what this metamorphosis would be like, countless transcendent beings had their own thoughts and guesses. Their thoughts and guesses, at least on the whole, all made sense. However, apart from a small portion that complemented each other, most of their guesses were clearly wrong. If it had been during the endless world tribulation, these guesses would have been enough to cause a new round of chaos in the endless world. However, it was clear that this was not the time for the endless world tribulation. As a result, these different guesses only formed different sects in the end. Instead, it caused this boundless world to blossom with a myriad of flowers, making it exceptionally splendid. Moreover, because of these countless guesses, their exploration of the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation was also in full swing. Even now, the final path had not been explored by them. However, by relying on many guesses, they found countless different cultivation directions and cultivation paths. These cultivation directions and paths of cultivation were extremely strange, and all of them were extremely mysterious. Almost all of the cultivation directions and cultivation paths were different from the correct ones, and it could even be said that there were omissions and mistakes. However, they were enough to make the millions of fifth tribulation experts much more resourceful than ordinary fifth tribulation experts. Of course, in the end, these cultivation paths and cultivation directions were still wrong. In terms of real power, they were still a little weaker than the fifth tribulation experts on the fifth level of the Tao Master Path. However, even if they were a little weaker, these explorations were not meaningless. At least, there were many cultivation paths and cultivation directions that led to the sixth tribulation experts. However, these paths and cultivation directions might be much longer than the correct path and the correct direction, and the foundation might not be as solid. Of course, this did not mean much to the fifth tribulation experts. Those fifth tribulation experts dared to test their own cultivation paths and cultivation directions on themselves, which meant that they were quite confident that this cultivation path and cultivation direction could lead them to their goal. In other words, all the cultivation paths and cultivation directions had a large number of fifth tribulation experts who firmly believed that they were actually the correct path and cultivation direction. regardless of whether this path and this direction could really bring them to the level of a sixth tribulation expert. It's been far, far too long. Compared to the previous few paths, the birth of this path is far, far too long. In a certain place, a few fifth tribulation cultivators gathered together. One of them sighed and said, "The path from the third tribulation expert to the fourth tribulation expert was born in the endless heaven and earth tribulations. Because of the endless heaven and earth tribulations, the time interval between the birth of this path and the birth of the previous path was obviously not meaningful, but it could not be included in the scope of measurement. However, the path from the fourth tribulation expert to the fifth tribulation expert was born in a normal state, so the time interval between the birth of this path and the birth of the previous path was obviously quite significant. Moreover, if the time interval between the third tribulation expert and the third tribulation expert was not considered, the time interval between the fourth tribulation expert and the fifth tribulation expert was actually quite normal. It would not be shorter than the time interval between the second tribulation expert and the third tribulation expert, but the time interval would not be too long. It would only be a few hundred times longer. Therefore, the time interval between the fourth tribulation expert and the fifth tribulation expert could obviously be included in the scope of consideration. According to the normal law, the time interval between the fourth tribulation expert and the fifth tribulation expert until now was already tens of millions of times longer than the time interval between the third tribulation expert and the fourth tribulation expert. Compared to the normal time interval of a few hundred times, this was clearly much, much longer. It had long exceeded the scope of the normal time interval. Under such circumstances, how could the fifth tribulation experts not know that something was wrong? The longer the time interval, the greater the transformation of this path. A fifth tribulation expert sighed and said with some anticipation, "That's right, but the time interval is too long. Normally speaking, that path should have been born billions of trillions of years ago. It's not like now, after so long, we are still searching in confusion." Another fifth tribulation expert sighed. Perhaps, from a certain point of view, the path had actually been born billions of years ago. Suddenly, a fifth tribulation expert said, "Huh." The other fifth tribulation experts were slightly stunned. Then, they all sighed in realization. One of them said, "You mean the path that we have found now?" However, although we are unwilling to admit it, these paths are clearly still a certain distance from the real path. Perhaps these paths can allow us to reach the sixth tribulation level, but it will definitely be a detour. A detour is still a path. The fifth tribulation experts' eyes lit up. As long as we can reach the end, then we can sort out this path in reverse and straighten the detours. Wouldn't that be good? The other fifth tribulation experts shook their heads and smiled bitterly. Right now, we have taken a detour. Before the final breakthrough, we still have a chance to change it. But if we rely on this detour to break through, I'm afraid it will be very difficult to change it. One of them sighed and said, "In fact, this was the fundamental reason why most transcending experts at the fifth tribulation level had their own path. Although they thought that their path could reach their goal and allow them to break through, they didn't truly wholeheartedly rely on this path to break through. Making a breakthrough through a detour could indeed allow them to become a sixth tribulation expert. It could indeed allow them to see from a strategically advantageous perspective which detours, which were unnecessary, and which were hidden dangers on the path they had taken. However, in that case, only the other fifth tribulation experts would benefit from it. For them, they had already made a huge mistake. In the future, they might not even have the chance to repent. Even if they could repent and start all over again, they would need to spend a lot of time and pay a huge price to do so. Under such circumstances, how could those fifth tribulation experts be willing to do so? Although they had things that they couldn't let go of, although they were more sentimental than other cultivators, they were still cultivators after all. They had their own selfish motives. Sacrificing oneself to help others, unless it was absolutely necessary, unless it was related to an existence that they cared about more than themselves, they would never be willing to do such a thing. Obviously, wasn't it urgent to explore the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation? Was it something that would cause serious consequences if they didn't do it? Even if they couldn't explore it for the endless heaven and earth, it was just delaying the transformation a little bit. What impact would it have on the endless heaven and earth? Moreover, if the transformation was a catastrophic one, delaying it would actually be beneficial to the endless heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, how could they sacrifice themselves to help others? Suddenly, a fifth tribulation expert looked strangely at the fifth tribulation expert who said that a detour was also a path. He said in disbelief, "Fellow Taoist, could it be that you want to walk this path and see for yourself?" When the other fifth tribulation experts heard this, they also looked at the fifth tribulation expert expectantly. Obviously, it couldn't be better if he really thought that way. They naturally weren't willing to sacrifice themselves, and they couldn't force others to sacrifice themselves. However, if others were willing to sacrifice themselves, then they definitely wouldn't be polite. When the fifth tribulation expert heard this, his expression changed. No, why would I have such an idea? Chapter 31:75. The fifth tribulation overlord didn't bring this up because he really wanted to sacrifice himself. He just wanted to explore the possibility. If he was really forced to sacrifice himself because of these few words, he would have to walk on the path that was obviously a detour or even a path with huge loopholes and pave the way for the other fifth tribulation experts. Then he would really suffer a great loss. Under such circumstances, he naturally had to use the most resolute attitude to reject their ideas and use the most resolute method to show that he would never sacrifice himself like that. When the other fifth tribulation overlords heard this, they couldn't help but sigh. They were obviously a little disappointed. The fifth tribulation overlord was unhappy. "What do you mean? Are you all very disappointed that I don't sacrifice myself?" When the other fifth tribulation overlords saw his expression, they all hid their expressions and acted as if nothing had happened. They directly talked about their own paths and all kinds of novel things that happened in this endless world over the years. The fifth tribulation overlord didn't really take this matter to heart. After all, among the millions of fifth tribulation overlords, the fact that they could gather together in this world to talk about their own paths of cultivation meant that they were friends with each other. This kind of friendship was obviously not something that could be erased with just a few words. Moreover, their behavior just now was actually more like teasing each other. If the fifth tribulation overlord really decided to sacrifice himself, the others would definitely try to persuade him instead. In this way, this matter was naturally in the past. After a while, the fifth tribulation overlord sighed and said, "I've been observing the world recently. A great change is about to happen." The other fifth tribulation overlords were slightly stunned. Among them, the person with the best divination ability was this person. Now that he said this, it was obviously not without reason. A great change? It can't be that the true path is about to appear, right? A fifth tribulation overlord frowned and said, "Actually, it's almost there. After all, it's been so long. No matter how slow it is, it's actually already too exaggerated by now. When the true path appears isn't something to be surprised about." Another fifth tribulation overlord looked a little expectant, but also a little worried. Suddenly, someone said, "I think there's actually another possibility." The others looked at him with doubt in their eyes. From the looks of it, the possibility of what he was about to say was not simple, and it was extremely likely that it involved many people. Otherwise, he would not have shown such an expression. What possibility? The fifth tribulation expert who said that a drastic change was about to occur was obviously the most concerned about this matter. At this moment, he directly asked, "Could it be that the next endless tribulation of heaven and earth is coming?" That person said hesitantly. His words instantly made all the fifth tribulation experts speechless. They had all experienced how terrifying the endless tribulation of heaven and earth was. It was so much so that some of them were directly controlled by the tribulation and became part of it. Under such circumstances, how could they underestimate the terror of the endless tribulation of heaven and earth? That's impossible. I've never heard of the endless tribulation of the world happening multiple times. After a long time, a five tribulation cultivator murmured. He clearly didn't want to believe that the terrifying endless tribulation of the world would appear again. one must know that the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth was simply a huge reshuffle for the endless heavens and earth. Within it, all the transcendent beings were like ants. The endless heavens and earth seemed to have turned into bubbles that could collapse at any time. If such a tribulation were to appear again, they had no confidence that they would be able to survive until the tribulation passed. In fact, they had no confidence that the endless heavens and earth could survive that tribulation. How can there only be one tribulation? The fifth tribulation expert who said that a drastic change was about to occur sighed. To be able to make such a judgment, it was clear that he had already deeply considered the tribulation. He felt that there was a high chance that the tribulation would appear again, which was why he said it here. Since that was the case, the person who had the most right to describe the tribulation here was naturally him. Just like our heaven and earth, there should have been tribulations born before. Could it be that those tribulations only appear once? Which part of the world would be able to sit back and relax after surviving a tribulation? That is the case for the endless heavens and earth. How can there be an exception? He sighed and said. His words dispelled the wishful thinking of all the fifth tribulation experts. Every heaven and earth had experienced tribulations before. Moreover, the number of tribulations that each heaven and earth had experienced would only appear once in a certain period of time. Even if they relied on the transcendent heaven and earth, it was the same. Since the birth of their heaven and earth, who knew how many trillions of years had passed? The number of tribulations that they had experienced would probably be counted in the trillions. With so many tribulations, if it wasn't for them suppressing and protecting everything, perhaps their heaven and earth would have already been completely destroyed by one of the tribulations and turned into a land of death. It was just like the endless heavens and earth. If those endless heavens and earth were like that, then there were other existences. What about the endless heavens and earth? Were the endless heavens and earth's tribulations only once? Could it be that after surviving one endless heavens and earth's tribulations, the endless heavens and earth would be free of worries, and no more tribulations would befall them? Clearly, according to normal logic, the possibility of that was very low. The development of the endless heavens and earth's tribulations back then was not a crude change in tribulations. It was clearly an extremely meticulous process that had a fixed rule and a perfect internal logic. Clearly, it was not the first time that a tribulation with such a performance had appeared at that time, since this endless heavens and earth's tribulations had appeared more than once, and had even formed various fixed rules and perfect internal logic. It meant that there were definitely more existences that could trigger the endless heavens and earth's tribulations. Although it was unknown what the tribulations were testing and what they wanted to see, it was clear that if it was only a single tribulation, it would be very difficult to truly test what they wanted to see the most. Therefore, from this aspect, just from the mature performance of the endless heavens and earth's tribulations, it should be possible to know that this endless heavens and earth's tribulations would not only appear once. If one looked at it from another perspective, it was actually very easy to reach the same answer. What would the existences that could trigger the endless heavens and earth's tribulations be like? Perhaps they were endless heavens and earth, or perhaps they were existences that were similar in nature to the endless heavens and earth, but their performance was completely different. What kind of existences were they? What was their upper limit, and what was their lower limit? Obviously, if one truly studied it deeply, one would know that the upper limit was infinite, and the lower limit was also infinite. In this case, if one considered it in terms of the lower limit, even a single heaven and earth could be regarded as an existence similar to the endless heavens and earth. In other words, an existence that could trigger the endless heavens and earth's tribulations. Of course, if one considered it in terms of the lower limit, then the endless heavens and earth's tribulations would also transform into a certain kind of tribulation for a single heaven and earth. If one looked at it from this perspective, then one could clearly see the fact that every existence similar to the endless heavens and earth would encounter a large number of tribulations. After all, the heaven and earth could be considered as one of those existences, and the heaven and earth would obviously encounter a large number of tribulations. Under such circumstances, if one were to determine that the endless heavens and earth only had one tribulation, then it would obviously be equivalent to determining that the endless heavens and earth was the most special existence among the countless existences that could trigger the endless heavens and earth's tribulations. Although the endless heavens and earth was unique in the eyes of all the cultivators in the endless heavens and earth, this was only its status in their eyes. Just like the saying went, no matter how good or bad a place was, one's own kennel could not compare to a golden or silver nest. Even the dumbest cultivator would clearly understand that the endless heavens and earth might only be an extremely ordinary existence among the countless similar existences. Compared to other existences, it was actually not all that special. Clearly, this understanding was enough to dispel the idea that the endless heavens and earth could only encounter one endless heavens and earth tribulation. It's not impossible. A fifth tribulation powerhouse sighed with an indescribable nervousness on his face. The second endless heavens and earth tribulation would definitely be more dangerous than the first. This was something that would definitely be acknowledged as long as one admitted that the endless heavens and earth's tribulations did not only happen once. Even if one did not consider the development of the endless heavens and earth situation, one could actually come to this conclusion just by considering the situation of the endless heavens and earth itself. After all, the scale of the endless heavens and earth's first endless heavens and earth's tribulation was clearly far inferior to the current endless heavens and earth. This also meant that the scale and level of power needed to affect the endless heavens and earth clearly could not pose too great of a threat to the current endless heavens and earth. And if it could not pose a great threat to the endless heavens and earth, then could it still be considered a tribulation? Therefore, if the endless heavens and earth's tribulation descended again, then its scale would definitely be much, much more terrifying than before. To the many transcendents, this also meant that the threat of the endless heavens and earth's tribulation was far, far greater than before. As long as one was willing to think about it, they would be able to clearly understand this. These fifth tribulation powerhouses were clearly not unwilling to think about it. Of course, they would also be able to clearly understand this. Therefore, at this moment, they all had solemn expressions. Recently, the atmosphere of the endless heavens and earth has changed slightly. It's probably because of this worry. One of the fifth tribulation powerhouses had a look of understanding and worry on his face. These fifth tribulation powerhouses were not delusional. Naturally, they did not think that they were unique, nor did they think that they were the most special batch of fifth tribulation powerhouses in the endless heavens and earth. As a result, they naturally did not think that others would not know what they knew. If they could guess that a second endless heavens and earth's tribulation was about to descend, then there would definitely be other transcendents who could guess this. Right now, these are just our own guesses. There's no need to scare ourselves. A fifth tribulation powerhouse shook his head and smiled. From the looks of it, it seemed like he wanted to shake all the unhappy guesses out of his mind. The other fifth tribulation powerhouses all smiled, but their smiles were rather bitter. Although it was just a guess, they were all fifth tribulation powerhouses. Any guess that appeared in their minds could not be without reason. Since this guess appeared in their minds, it meant that there was a certain probability that it would happen. Perhaps the probability of this happening wasn't too high, but it was a real possibility. If they really treated this guess as nonsense and completely ignored it, then they would clearly be irresponsible for their own lives and the fate of their own world. Perhaps, but in the end, we still can't be careless. We have to deal with it properly. A fifth tribulation powerhouse sighed. As these fifth tribulation powerhouses were bewildered, although there were no such discussions in other places in the endless heavens and earth, the overall atmosphere had unknowingly become heavy. It was as if a storm was about to arrive. Clearly, although they did not truly guess in the direction of the second endless heavens and earth tribulation, many transcendents vaguely felt that some sort of upheaval might appear in the endless heavens and earth. In the face of this upheaval, they naturally could not treat it lightly. Of course, they would make all sorts of corresponding preparations. More and more people are noticing the signs of a tribulation. In a certain world, a transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation level side. This sixth tribulation powerhouse's cultivation was somewhat related to tribulations. His perception of the signs of tribulations was something that other cultivation paths could not compare to. The other cultivators were still at a loss about the impending storm, but he had already determined that this atmosphere was a sign of an impending tribulation. Unfortunately, they don't know that their current preparations are actually hastening the evolution of a tribulation. Then, he shook his head and spoke with a somewhat inexplicable expression. Tribulations came from a state of chaos, but they did not completely rely on that state to evolve. In the end, the form in which it would descend was closely related to the existence undergoing the tribulation. For the endless heavens and earth, it was also closely related to everything in the endless heavens and earth. After all, tribulations could have countless manifestations and possibilities. Triggering a tribulation only confirmed that one or more of these countless possibilities would descend. As for which one or more possibilities it would depend on the existence undergoing the tribulation. In this case, the form in which the second endless heavens and earth's tribulation would descend upon the endless heavens and earth would obviously depend on the possibility of the endless heavens and earth's compatibility with that tribulation. And this compatibility, of course, depended on the state of things in the endless heavens and earth, as well as the state of living beings. Chapter 31:76. In other words, the endless heaven and earth tribulation was like something floating above the endless heaven and earth, and it could descend at any time. When the cultivators sensed its existence, it meant that it had already arrived at the top of the endless heavens and earth, and it was beginning to consider how to descend. Under such circumstances, the more people moved, or rather, the more those who had transcended, the less time it would take for the endless heaven and earth tribulation to choose a method to descend. The time it took for the endless heaven and earth tribulation to descend would naturally accelerate. Even if the actions of those who had transcended were actually preparing to resist the endless heaven and earth tribulation, the final outcome would not change at all. The experienced and knowledgeable six tribulation powerhouses were actually quite clear on this point. Although it was their first time encountering the endless heaven and earth tribulation, their deep understanding of the endless heaven and earth tribulation was enough for them to be certain of this point. The guess that the second endless heaven and earth tribulation was highly likely to descend was ultimately only a premonition of a small portion of the people who had transcended. Most of the people who had transcended were not as sharp and could not clearly sense this point. Thus, the endless heaven and earth tribulation surface did not change too much because of this. Most of the fifth tribulation powerhouses were still working hard to find the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. They were searching for the shocking transformation that would occur when the final path appeared. Although the true path had not been found, there were already too many paths that were not completely correct but were still passable. Thus, the endless heaven and earth tribulation seemed to be in full bloom, and there was an indescribable vitality brewing in the endless heaven and earth tribulation. Time passed by slowly. In this strange atmosphere, billions of years passed unknowingly. This period of time was nothing to tribulation powerhouses. At most, it was just a period of time that they could barely talk about. However, to the many worlds in the endless heaven and earth tribulation, it was rather long. In these billions of years, the situation in the many worlds in the endless heaven and earth tribulation had changed greatly. The cultivators had changed countless batches. Even the situation in the world of cultivation was no longer the same as it had been in the past. After all, it had been billions of years. Normally, if a cultivator didn't become a false saint, they would measure their time in terms of 10,000 years in Yuanhui. In other words, for cultivators who had yet to become false sages, a few hundred yuan hui was already considered a very long time. How many years were there in a yuan? It's only 129,600 years. A few hundred yuan hui was only tens of millions of years. If one wanted to look down on billions of years of time, it was obvious that only existences above the false sage level could do so. The existences above the false saint realm obviously did not pursue activities in the cultivation world of the world. For them, what they pursued was only transcendence from the world. In this way, the changes in the world naturally did not have much to do with them. That was why things were like this. It had only been a few billion years, but the situation in these worlds had changed so much. The changes in the world naturally caused the atmosphere in the world to change. The change in the world's atmosphere would naturally affect the attitude of the rulers of the world. In other words, the people who had transcended. As a result, even though it was only a few billion years, which was not a lot of time for tribulation powerhouses, the thoughts of those who had transcended had unknowingly changed. Of course, it was naturally impossible for them to completely go from being extremely vigilant to being completely unconcerned. However, more or less, their worry about the endless heaven and earth tribulation descending had weakened by a lot. As a result, the atmosphere in the endless heaven and earth tribulation had changed correspondingly, becoming much more relaxed than before. This process of change clearly sped up the speed of the endless heaven and earth tribulation's descent once again. After all, for the endless heaven and earth tribulation, any change in the endless heaven and earth tribulation would determine what form it would descend in. Over the past few billion years, the change in the mentality of many people who had transcended was clearly a type of change. Moreover, it was an extremely obvious change. However, the six tribulation experts who could see this clearly were secretly worried. However, they could only worry and nothing more. They were also in the endless heaven and earth tribulation. Their actions would only cause a greater reaction than the other transcendent powerhouses, not any less. Therefore, they had to be responsible for themselves and the endless heaven and earth tribulation. The best way was to reduce their actions and make the endless heaven and earth tribulation pretend that they did not exist. That would be perfect. However, this was only an extravagant hope. While the cultivators who understood the danger were secretly anxious, and the ordinary transcendent powerhouses felt that the situation was perfect, the situation slowly developed. At a certain moment, many fifth tribulation powerhouses who had found their cultivation path, or rather, those who had clearly taken a detour and had clearly overlooked it, disappeared from the endless heaven and earth tribulation at the same time. As they disappeared, their respective worlds also disappeared. Although not all the fifth tribulation powerhouses were transcendent powerhouses, more than 80% of them were transcendent powerhouses. Too much time had passed since the birth of the fourth tribulation to the fifth tribulation path. During those billions of years, even the stupidest fifth tribulation powerhouses would unknowingly come up with their own understanding of the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation path during their cultivation. As for why the remaining 20% of fifth tribulation powerhouses didn't come up with such a path, the reason was not complicated. It was just that the remaining cultivators hadn't reached the fifth tribulation long enough. After all, fifth tribulation powerhouses weren't born in one go. They were scattered throughout the endless heaven and earth tribulation, and only one cultivator would be able to walk the correct path and become a fifth tribulation powerhouse after countless years. It could be said that being able to have one in billions of years was already an extremely smooth cultivation path. Therefore, among the millions of fifth tribulation powerhouses, there were bound to be some who reached the sixth tribulation near the present time. And because these fifth tribulation powerhouses didn't have enough time, they didn't come up with a suitable cultivation path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. Even if there were mistakes and detours on the path of cultivation, the tribulation has come. At this moment, countless transcendent powerhouses came to this realization. At this moment, the entire endless heaven and earth was shrouded by an indescribable killing intent. This killing intent filled every inch of the endless heaven and earth, enveloping every corner of the endless heaven and earth, and even infiltrating every living thing in the endless heaven and earth. Even the six tribulation powerhouses couldn't escape the infiltration of this killing intent. In the beginning, all cultivators and even all living beings felt this killing intent. Although one needed to reach a certain level of strength to truly recognize this killing intent, However, after a short while, they no longer felt anything. This killing intent only revealed its true form the moment it appeared. After that, all of the killing intent completely fused with the endless heaven and earth. The two became one, two, and one. It looked like a natural product of the endless heaven and earth, like the origin energy of the world, like the nothingness of the void, like the air that living beings needed to breathe, like the laws that cultivators needed to cultivate, and so on and so forth. It was something that the endless heaven and earth naturally had. After this change, all living beings naturally couldn't feel its existence anymore. Of course, even if they couldn't sense it, after the baleful aura appeared, all living beings knew that the world was slightly different from before. Although they couldn't tell what exactly was different, just how will it appear? At this moment, many cultivators who understood that the tribulation had arrived were somewhat bewildered. They couldn't understand how this tribulation appeared. It actually took away a portion of the fifth tribulation powerhouses the moment it descended. This situation had never happened before in their knowledge. Even the six tribulation powerhouses had never seen a tribulation like this. How could they not be bewildered? However, at this moment, they could only raise their vigilance and inform everyone that they cared about so that they could think of a way to deal with the possible changes. I didn't expect this kind of tribulation to happen. At this moment, in a place that seemed to be between the endless heavens and earth, Luo Fan's incarnation sighed with emotion in his heart. The behavior of the second endless heaven and earth tribulation was also completely unfamiliar to him. Compared to the six tribulation powerhouses, Luo Fan was much more knowledgeable when it came to tribulations. However, even he had never seen a tribulation like this. From this, it was enough to show how strange the endless heaven and earth tribulation was. At this time, Luo Fan finally pulled his attention away from the process of immersing himself in the grand exchange between the endless world and the ocean of nothingness, and shifted it to the tribulations encountered in the endless world. At the same time, outside the countless island branches, the six tribulation powerhouses who were trying to find all kinds of information about the island branches suddenly found that the target of their exploration had suddenly changed. The island branches that didn't refuse them at first suddenly rejected them completely. It was as if an unimaginably strong barrier had appeared outside the countless island branches at the same time, completely isolating all their methods, and even themselves outside the barrier. This barrier is almost the barrier of the perfect world. At this moment, a knowledgeable six tribulation powerhouse said in a daze, "How is that possible?" The other six tribulation powerhouses couldn't believe it. If it's really the barrier of the perfect world, wouldn't it be able to appear directly in the state of chaos? Another six tribulation powerhouse exclaimed. There were many levels of barriers between the heaven and earth. The worst was, of course, the space barrier, followed by the world barrier. There were also many levels within the two, such as the small space barrier, the grotto heaven space barrier, the eternal space barrier, the small kiliocosm barrier, the medium kiliocosm barrier, the big kiliocosm barrier, and so on. Although these barriers were not called the barrier of the heaven and earth, they were actually a kind of barrier of the heaven and earth. It was just that their levels were too low, so they couldn't be called the barrier of the heaven and earth. Above this was the real barrier of the heaven and earth. Above the barrier of the heaven and earth was the perfect barrier of the heaven and earth. Above it was the great barrier of the heaven and earth. Although the perfect barrier of the heaven and earth only differed by one word. In fact, the difference between the two was like the difference between heaven and earth. Of course, there were many kinds of ordinary barriers of the heaven and earth, such as the small barrier of the heaven and earth, the flowing light barrier of the heaven and earth, the invisible barrier of the heaven and earth, and so on. But no matter what kind of barrier of the heaven and earth, as long as it was at the level of the ordinary barrier of the heaven and earth, it couldn't really resist the state of chaos. If such a barrier of the heaven and earth appeared in the state of chaos, it could only last for a period of time at most. Not long after, it would be eroded, assimilated, destroyed by the state of chaos, and then completely lose the function of the barrier. This was also one of the reasons why the ordinary barrier of the heaven and earth couldn't really exist in the state of chaos. But once the word perfect was added, from the ordinary barrier of the heaven and earth to the perfect barrier of the heaven and earth, the situation was obviously completely different. The perfect barrier of the heaven and earth, as the name suggested, was a barrier of the heaven and earth that could only exist in a perfect world. This kind of barrier of the heaven and earth could easily exist in the state of chaos, completely ignoring the invasion of the state of chaos. If one looked at it from the extremely deep time dimension hidden in the state of chaos, even if it existed for a long time, the state of chaos would not cause any harm to it. In fact, the reason why the perfect world could exist in the state of chaos for eternity was because of this perfect barrier of the heaven and earth. Of course, it wasn't the only reason. As for the barrier above this, there was no need to even mention it. It naturally contained even more mysteries, and even more mysteries. Naturally, there was no need to mention it. And now, this barrier of the island that appeared in front of the 6 tribulation powerhouses was actually the perfect barrier of the heaven and earth. How could those 6 tribulation powerhouses believe this? Chapter 31:77. The difference between a perfect heaven and earth barrier and an ordinary heaven and earth barrier was huge. In terms of cultivation, a perfect heaven and earth barrier was like a true sage. On the other hand, an ordinary heaven and earth barrier was below a true sage. It was extremely difficult for a cultivator to become a sage, and it was extremely difficult for an ordinary heaven and earth barrier to become a perfect heaven and earth barrier. It could be said that it was not something that an existence below a true sage could do. At least, it was not something that an existence below a true sage could do alone. Even though Luo Fan seemed to have created something similar to a perfect heaven and earth several times in the past, it was only because of the right time, the right place, and the right people. The one who really put in the most effort was actually not him. Even so, those perfect heaven and earth that he created were somewhat specious, and there was an indescribable gap between them and the true perfect heaven and earth. This gap was something that he could not see or understand in the past. But now, as his cultivation realm continued to increase, as he went through one tribulation after another, and as his knowledge became more and more extensive, he gradually saw the gap between those so-called perfect heaven and earth and the true perfect heaven and earth. However, it was still difficult for him to specifically say what the gap was. If Luo Fan was like this, then it was even more so for the other cultivators. At this time, many 6 tribulation powerhouses looked at the unimaginably powerful heaven and earth barrier in front of them and felt that everything was so strange. They were not willing to admit that this was a perfect heaven and earth barrier, and they did not admit that this heaven and earth barrier had reached such an unimaginable height. However, all signs told them that the barrier in front of them was a perfect heaven and earth barrier. This contradiction between what they knew and what they saw caused the minds of many 6 tribulation powerhouses to become chaotic. Amidst the chaos, the gathering spots around the island became even livelier. All the 6 tribulation powerhouses were trying their best to confirm what they saw and felt through communication with other 6 tribulation powerhouses. They wanted to figure out what the changes on the island branches represented and what impact it would have on their goals. In the end, all the conclusions pointed to the point that the heaven and earth barrier had become a perfect heaven and earth barrier. Moreover, it had become a perfect heaven and earth barrier that absolutely repelled all foreign objects and living beings from entering. It was not a normal perfect heaven and earth barrier that did not repel living beings. This kind of barrier was obviously the most unfriendly to many 6 tribulation experts. One must know that a normal perfect world barrier did not possess incredible potential, such that it could resist the corrosion and influence of the primal chaos. However, this kind of perfect world barrier with ordinary potential, under the influence of the perfect world barrier itself, had choices. Generally, it was only targeted at the chaotic state. As for the entry of foreign living beings and foreign substances, it was not much of a hindrance. Because of this, ordinary cultivators could easily pass through a perfect barrier of the world as long as they were powerful enough. Whether it was from the outside or from the inside, it wouldn't be too difficult. Take a country, for example. Although it had the ability to keep all foreigners out of the country, under normal circumstances, most countries would obviously not do so. They would set up some rules and allow foreigners who were willing to abide by the rules to enter and leave the country. Not only does the barrier of perfect heaven and earth have such a mechanism, but the barrier of big heaven and earth also has a similar mechanism. If there was a higher level of heaven and earth, the mechanism wouldn't be too different from this. The heaven and earth barrier of the island branch in front of them was obviously not the mechanism of a normal perfect heaven and earth barrier. It completely blocked the inside and the outside, making it impossible for anything inside and outside to pass through these barriers. It could be said that all the potential of the perfect heaven and earth barrier had been reversed to this kind of isolation. Under such circumstances, although those 6 tribulation experts were extremely eager to study the nature of these barriers, in the end, they could only look at these barriers and sigh. Could it be that it will always be like this in the future? The time it took for these barriers to appear is probably equivalent to billions of trillions of years inside. A 6 tribulation expert sighed. From the moment these barriers appeared until now, when they looked at them and sighed, several days had passed. According to the results of their previous exploration of the island branch, these few days were obviously equivalent to billions of trillions of years inside the island branch. Even the 6 tribulation experts couldn't imagine what kind of temporary changes would last for such a long time. In that case, they would naturally suspect that these changes might not be temporary, but permanent. And if it was a permanent change, wouldn't it mean that they would no longer have any chance to enter the island branch and obtain the benefits that it might give them? Thinking of this, those 6 tribulation experts couldn't help but feel regretful and lucky. They regretted that they didn't seize the opportunity and might have missed the benefits that the island branch might give them forever. Fortunately, they didn't seize the opportunity to take the initiative to enter before. Otherwise, wouldn't their avatar be separated from their real body forever? At the very least, it was equivalent to completely abandoning it. If the situation was a little worse, maybe the avatar would directly become independent. Although they lost the opportunity now, they also avoided danger. Naturally, it was something worth rejoicing over. In fact, those 6 tribulation experts' worries were obviously unnecessary. This perfect heaven and earth barrier was not built by any cultivator, but directly from the endless second heaven and earth tribulation. In other words, it came from the chaotic state. This kind of perfect heaven and earth barrier built by such an existence was naturally absolutely perfect, a truly perfect heaven and earth barrier. Such an existence, however, had all kinds of incredible powers. These powers, depending on the situation and the will of the existence that built the barrier, would have different manifestations. Among them, the most obvious manifestation of the heaven and earth barrier that appeared this time was discovered by those 6 tribulation experts. It completely isolated the inside from the outside, so that no cultivator could pass through this barrier. However, this was clearly only the most obvious manifestation of the barrier. Beneath this obvious manifestation, there was another characteristic of the barrier that was being displayed. That was, it completely separated the space-time inside and outside the barrier. This kind of division was essentially different from the division between the world inside the island branch and the 6th level of the town master's road outside. It seemed to be much more absolute than the previous division. Previously, there was an incredible difference in the flow of time between the world inside the island branch and the 6th level of the town master's road. This was indeed a manifestation of the separation of the space-time inside and outside. After all, if there was no division, the flow of time would not be so different. But, in fact, this division was still not complete. There was a difference in the flow of time that could be measured by specific multiples. This was a kind of comparison, and the existence of such a comparison meant that there was still a connection between the two. It was like comparing one thing with another. If there was no common standard, if there was no comparison between the two, how could the two be compared? Therefore, the existence of a comparison meant the existence of a connection. And the existence of such a connection naturally meant that the division was not complete. There is obviously such a relationship between the world inside the island branch and the sixth level of the town master's road outside the island branch. This obviously meant that the division between the inside of the island branch and the sixth level of the town master's road was not complete. But now, with the perfect heaven and earth barrier, the situation was obviously different. As a perfect heaven and earth barrier, it could even completely separate the chaotic state from the inside of the world. One could imagine how strong its division ability was. Now, the characteristics of this perfect heaven and earth barrier were obviously stimulating this division ability to an unimaginable degree. It was many times stronger than the previous division between the island branch and the outside world. Under such circumstances, the comparison between the flow of time inside of the island branch and the sixth level of the town master's road naturally no longer existed. In other words, in front of this perfect heaven and earth barrier that showed such a strong division ability, the comparison between the flow of time inside of the sixth level of the town master's road and the flow of time inside of the island branch had obviously become meaningless. The comparison of time explored by the experts of the six tribulations outside was obviously no longer of any value. Now, although several days had passed in the outside world, the time inside of the island branch was obviously not the same as usual. No one knew how many billions of years had passed. Of course, no one knew how much time had passed except for true sages. Even Luo Fan was the same. Even the true sages who were eliminated because no one knew what kind of incredible techniques the true sages had, which was why they were eliminated. But it was not because true sages had any specific characteristics that allowed them to bypass many restrictions and clearly determine how much time had passed inside. The only way to know how much time had passed was to wait for the perfect barrier of heaven and earth to disappear. Only when the island branch re-established the comparative connection with the sixth level of the Tao Master's path could it be determined how much time had passed. And the possibility of how much time had passed was endless. Maybe it was billions of trillions of years. Maybe it was a moment. Maybe it was a few months or maybe a few years. As for how long it took, it all depended on luck. Of course, if the reason for the appearance of this perfect heaven and earth barrier was considered, this period of time could actually be related to another existence. That was the duration of the endless world's second endless tribulation. After all, this perfect heaven and earth barrier was born because of the endless world tribulation. Under such circumstances, the duration would naturally be the same as the descent of the endless tribulation. In other words, no matter how much time had passed outside, as long as the endless world tribulation passed, the perfect heaven and earth barrier would disappear. This also meant that no matter how much time had passed outside, as long as the heaven and earth barrier disappeared, it meant that the endless world tribulation had lasted for a long time. In this way, it could be said that the time that had passed inside the endless world tribulation had actually been determined. Now, the only question was how long the barrier existed compared to the sixth level of the Tao Master's road in the outside world. Perhaps this period of time could be countless years, or it could be a few days, or it could be a few months, or it could be a few years. This obviously depended on the various factors related to the state of chaos that the practitioners below the true divine level could not understand. However, for the experts of the six tribulations, these were obviously shrouded in fog. At this time, all they could do was let their imaginations run wild outside. Obviously, no matter what method they used, they could not find the answer they were looking for. Even the disciples of the Tao Master were confused at this time and could not figure out what was going on. Although, as the disciples of the Tao Master, they felt that the difference in the flow of time was not as simple as others thought. They could not go deeper to find the truth. At this time, in Luo Fan's heavens, Luo Fan slightly frowned. He turned his head to look at the branch of the island. At this moment, he also felt that the connection between his real body and the incarnation that built the branch of the island had been weakened to an indescribable limit. Under this limit, he could still control his incarnation and ensure that his incarnation belonged to him. He could still ensure that his incarnation had not become an independent creature. However, apart from this, he could not be sure of anything about his incarnation. He could not guarantee anything. At this time, the incarnation seemed to be in a state of uncertainty. It was an extremely strange state where even time was uncertain. This state was even more mysterious and incomprehensible than the situation when he sent an incarnation into the Tianyuan great world through the state of chaos. At that time, he almost completely lost the sense of his incarnation. Although he could be sure that his incarnation still belonged to him and was still not independent, he could not sense the state of the incarnation at all. He could only rely on the spiritual connection to contact the incarnation's past, present, or future from time to time. Poster, Chair, Chapter 3178. Compared to the past, the current situation was less confusing with the past, present, and future, but more uncertain. Although the performance of the two was different, in fact, for Luo Fan, the two situations were also beyond the limits of what he could handle. Now, he could only quietly wait for the development of the situation to change naturally, and finally let his incarnation return to a definite state and reestablish an inseparable and close connection with him. I wonder how long the state can last. With such a thought flashing in his mind, Luo Fan once again focused his attention on the task of continuously building new incarnations. Compared to the past, the scale of the incarnation nebula in this all heavens didn't decrease much. Of course, it didn't increase by much. This situation clearly meant that the number of incarnations that were born was already in a balanced state compared to the number of incarnations that left this all heavens. In other words, the projection of the world of laws that was born at every moment was roughly on par with the speed at which Luo Fan was building his incarnations in the all heavens. At this time, it had already been more than 100 years since Luo Fan began to build these projections of the world of laws. From this, it could be seen how large the scale of the projections of the world of laws had become. Although it was still a few orders of magnitude less than the number of branches on the islands, it was still extremely shocking. And this shock made it so that even though the changes in the branches on the islands were so obvious and unbelievable, it still attracted a large number of Six Tribulation powerhouses to send their clones, incarnations, projections, and other existences to explore these projections of the world of laws. With so many projections of the world of laws that had the same worldview and the same great Tao, but completely different laws, the correlation function between the great Tao and laws that Luo Fan had spent so much effort to find had gradually formed a vague outline. Of course, although the number of the projections of the world of laws had already reached such a level that it might not be possible to count them clearly even if they were counted in the trillions, the number of the projections of the world of laws was still too little compared to the number of variables in the correlation function. At this moment, he was barely able to form a blurry silhouette. If he wanted it to appear more clearly, he obviously needed more projections of the world of laws, or rather, more layers of laws corresponding to the same great Taos. This situation didn't surprise Luo Fan too much. The existence of a nebula incarnation in the all heavens represented that he had a rough estimate of the number of world laws projections he needed. Based on this rough estimation, he naturally understood that it was impossible to obtain a truly accurate correlation function. In this way, he naturally wouldn't be surprised by this result. Even if he had to be surprised, it wouldn't be because the correlation function he obtained was only a vague outline. Instead, he should be surprised that he could obtain the vague outline of this correlation function at this time. For Luo Fan, obtaining the vague outline of the correlation function was not small at all. On the contrary, the benefits were so great that they exceeded his imagination. First of all, the most important and obvious change was that the volume of his world of laws had increased by several times in an instant. The increase in volume was naturally aimed at the vague correlation function. A complete world of laws had to be able to explain everything that living beings could understand. This included the world, the nomological laws, the great Tao, the chaotic state, and the primordial state before the chaotic state was born, and so on. Obviously, in the past, he had completely ignored the correlation function between the great Tao and the nomological laws. He only thought that a great Tao directly corresponded to a nomological law layer. This was obviously equivalent to directly substituting the correlation function that originally had countless variables into a constant. In essence, it was equivalent to taking a ladle of water from a boundless ocean. Under such circumstances, the volume of this world of laws would naturally be countless times smaller than the volume of the world of laws that included this correlation function. In this way, he had obtained such a vague outline of the correlation function. Although it couldn't be considered a true and accurate summary of the correlation function and complete the world of laws, just this outline alone was enough to see some correlation. It was just like an equation. Even if one didn't know what the numbers on both sides of the equation were and only saw a general outline, one could actually see some characteristics of the equation. For example, the numbers on one side could be obtained through some kind of calculation on the other side. If the degree of ambiguity was lower, one could even see what kind of calculation the numbers on one side were obtained from the other side, such as the root, the power, and so on, and being able to see this was obviously enough to obtain some numbers that were bound to match these calculations. Now, the situation was similar in Luo Fan's world of laws. Although the correlation function was quite vague, as long as there was an outline, it was enough to deduce many situations that were bound to match this outline. If this equation had 3 numbers and a symbol, then one could recognize that the symbol was the multiplication sign. Then these 3 numbers were all 0, so it must match this equation. Even if one didn't know other more complicated factors, one could be sure of this. This principle was also the same when applied to the world of laws. Therefore, obtaining this vague outline of the correlation function was obviously enough to greatly expand the volume of the world of laws. At least compared to the previous 101 constant, these few variables that were bound to match this vague outline were already a great expansion. This caused the volume of Luo Fan's world of laws to be greatly enhanced. This increase in the volume of this world of laws gave Luo Fan a kind of indescribable sense of fulfillment. He only felt that he seemed to have become more complete. His cultivation foundation also seemed to have become more stable because of this. This was the most obvious change. The second change was that he felt that his 8th major calamity seemed to have been brought forward by thousands of years. There was no obvious change in his cultivation realm, but the time of the 8th major calamity was brought forward. This was enough to show that the change that he was experiencing now was an extremely essential change. Regarding this, in the past, Luo Fan might have been worried. After all, it was the world's major calamity, and it was the 8th, which was also the second last major calamity. It was easy to imagine just how dangerous it would be. In the face of such a major calamity, it was natural for one to be on guard. And if such a major calamity was brought forward, then he would naturally be worried. However, it was obvious that this was only the previous Luo Fan. For the current him, this kind of worrying mentality was no longer there. Now he was extremely looking forward to the arrival of this major calamity. After all, he had already learned about the various descriptions of the Tao Master on the path of going against the flow. He clearly knew that the major calamity was actually the main body of cultivation on the path of going against the flow. It was the true opportunity of the cultivators who walked the path of going against the flow. The cultivation outside of the major calamity was actually just to obtain the qualification to step into the major calamity. Under such circumstances, for the arrival of the major calamity ahead of time, he naturally only had joy, only anticipation, and not much worry. It was precisely because of this that he listed this change as a benefit, of course, although he was looking forward to stepping into his 8th major calamity sooner. But Luo Fan did not immediately put everything aside and directly step into the 8th major calamity. After all, he still had his own cultivation outside of the major calamity. Whether it was the correlation function between the great ways and the nomological law layer that he wanted to find in the heaven and earth phantom, or the incomparably grand communication carried by the countless islands and branches, or the basic cultivation method of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, represented by his current heavens. He obviously needed to continue to do all of these outside of the major calamity. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for him to step into the major calamity immediately. It was precisely because of this that although he was looking forward to it, he did not specifically think of a way to speed up the arrival of his next major calamity. Although there were actually many ways that he could think of if he wanted to. As for when his eighth major calamity would come after being brought forward so much, it was still nearly 100 million years away. Such a long time was obviously enough for him to absorb the benefits brought by the cultivation above little by little. Feeling the benefits brought to him by the vague correlation function, Luo Fan calmed his mind and worked even harder to construct the incarnation. He then sent the incarnation into a certain layer of the nothingness ocean layer to continue creating the heaven and earth phantom. After more than 100 years of development, the many six tribulation powerhouses were no longer ignorant of this. Although they could not catch traces of Luo Fan, they could all know that some kind of existence had appeared out of thin air in a certain layer of the nothingness ocean layer, and then directly created the heaven and earth phantom in that layer of the nothingness ocean layer, forming a new place of cultivation. Naturally, those six tribulation experts were unwilling to be unable to catch traces of this existence. Therefore, there were a large number of six tribulation experts guarding the different layers of the void ocean, the region corresponding to the world of Lost Silhouette. They were waiting for Luo Fan's clone to appear, waiting for the world of Lost Silhouette to appear. And it was for the sake of grasping the truth of the entire process. It would be best if they could figure out the source of the birth of the heaven and earth phantom. Unfortunately, even though many of them had grasped the truth, they could only wait until the appearance of Luo Fan's incarnation and the appearance of the heaven and earth phantom. However, because of the huge gap in cultivation realm, although they seemed to be facing everything directly, they completely ignored Luo Fan's actions. In the end, what they obtained wasn't much more than what they had sensed through the nothingness ocean layer. But even so, those six tribulation experts weren't discouraged. As six tribulation experts, how could they lack patience since they were able to cultivate from zero to the current terrifying level that was inconceivable in the eyes of ordinary creatures? Not to mention that they had already failed thousands of times. Even if they failed billions of times, they would never give up as long as the process wasn't interrupted and the opportunity didn't disappear. Therefore, even if they failed again and again, they could only watch blindly as Luo Fan's incarnation easily created the heaven and earth phantom and connected it with the heaven and earth phantom in the other layers of the nothingness ocean layer, producing an indescribable resonance and forming an indescribably grand whole. It could be predicted that if these six tribulation experts didn't change their scouting methods, the number of times they failed here might really reach the point of billions of times. Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be moved by the repeated failures of the six tribulation experts. At this time, he remained unmoved in the face of their efforts, as if he hadn't discovered anything. He just continued to push forward the birth of the heaven and earth phantom according to his own rhythm. At this time, or rather, in that uncertain time, the development of the situation wasn't so peaceful. This place was naturally the endless world. For the outside world, the endless world had become a place where time was uncertain. It was a place where any time period could pass before the answer was truly revealed. However, for everything in the endless world, it was the outside world that was uncertain. For them, the time in the endless world wasn't much different from before. It was still flowing in an incomparably smooth manner like before. Of course, this didn't mean that there were no changes in the endless world. Don't forget that the endless world was currently in the midst of its second endless world tribulation. Under such circumstances, how could the endless world remain the same as before? At this moment, many transcendent experts felt an indescribable pressure shrouding their bodies and minds. They had a vague feeling that the world was about to undergo an incredible change. What form will it take? The transcendent experts all had such doubts in their hearts. It wasn't just one or two transcendent experts who had such doubts. Almost all the transcendent experts who already knew that the endless world was in the midst of its second endless world tribulation had similar doubts. And at this time, this range had basically captured all the transcending experts in this boundless world in one fell swoop. Chapter 3179. Before it was truly activated, the existence of the endless tribulations was hidden in the natural world. Those who could sense its existence were all existences that had extraordinary deductions and perception abilities. However, once the endless tribulations truly erupted, the threshold for sensing its existence would plummet like a diving board. At this point, anyone with some perception abilities would be able to discover the existence of the terrifying tribulations that filled the endless world. It was clear that those who had transcended would not have any problems in terms of perception abilities. Thus, when the endless tribulations truly erupted, those who could sense the existence of the endless tribulations had changed from the few who had transcended to nearly everyone who had transcended. Of course, this only applied to those who had transcended. It did not mean that only those who had transcended could discover the existence of the endless tribulations. In fact, aside from those who had transcended, there were too many cultivators in the endless world who could sense the existence of the endless tribulations. However, they were not those who had transcended. Their tentacles could not reach out of the world they had been born in. In the face of the endless tribulations, such existences were meaningless. Thus, they did not pay much attention to their situations. Amidst the anxiety of all living beings, an indescribable ripple was suddenly released from the depths of the boundless tribulation that affected the entire world. At this moment, the ominous aura that represented the endless tribulations, which had been hidden in the formless world, once again revealed itself. In this revealed state, the ominous aura began to deplete at an unimaginable speed. It was as if a huge hole had appeared in the ominous aura and was frantically devouring it. What is this? At this moment, the many who had transcended did not have the time to wonder how the ominous aura was being depleted. At this moment, they were all shocked by the terrifying fluctuation that had suddenly appeared and filled the entire world. This fluctuation seemed to have turned into some sort of indescribable and terrifying rope that pulled at them, wanted to pull them into an indescribable state. Under this pull, even the supreme power that they originally possessed, which could destroy the world, could not resist this terrifying pull. It was as if they had returned to when they were still mortals. When the pulling force disappeared, they discovered that they had appeared in an indescribable place. This place seemed to be heaven and earth, like a world like time and space, but it also seemed to be a simple illusion. At this moment, a sixth tribulation powerhouse muttered with an indescribable expression, "Is this the world created by the paths of the fifth tribulation powerhouses?" In fact, although all the transcendent transcendents and a large portion of the non-transcendent transcendents had been pulled into this mysterious world, the six tribulation experts were still very different from the rest. Although they had all been pulled in, the six tribulation powerhouses still had the ability to break free from the pulling force. Of course, during this process, they naturally had to pay a considerable price. However, if they were to break free from this pulling force, the power and might that they would unleash would probably surpass the limit of this endless tribulation of heaven and earth. Once their strength and might surpassed this limit, what awaited them was obviously not an easy way to extinguish the endless tribulation of the world. Instead, it would trigger an even more intense reaction from the primal chaos, causing the limit of the endless tribulation of the world to rise to an unbreakable level. The reason for this had already been discussed in the previous endless tribulations, so there was naturally no need to talk about it now. The reason for this had already been discussed in the previous endless heavenly tribulation. Naturally, there was no need to talk about it now. The reason for this had already been discussed in the previous endless tribulations, so there was naturally no need to talk about it now. Even if the number of sixth tribulation experts in this world had reached an unimaginable number that could only be calculated in the trillions, there was no exception. After all, to the endless world, it was indeed beneficial for the six tribulation powerhouses to endure the endless tribulations. However, compared to the benefits that the six tribulation powerhouses could obtain from this process, the benefits that the endless world could obtain seemed insignificant. To the endless world, the six tribulation powerhouses could keep their tribulations from going out of control so that they wouldn't break through to a level that ordinary transcendence could not endure. From this point of view, this was of course a considerable benefit to the endless world. However, to the six tribulation powerhouses, how could this benefit compare to the fact that the tribulations they encountered wouldn't pose a real threat to them? As long as they retracted their power and maintained it at a level close to the strongest of the transcendents in the boundless heaven and earth, they would be able to prevent the boundless heaven and earth from truly threatening them, no matter how it developed. Even if the boundless heaven and earth were destroyed by the boundless heaven and earth, they would still be able to survive. Unless one was a real fool, everyone would know how to make such a choice. Because of this, even though there were so many six tribulation powerhouses in the world, not a single six tribulation powerhouse made an exception. As for those transcendent transcendents who were at the level of six tribulation experts, they naturally knew the reason why they had concealed their existence and appeared so weak. And those transcendent transcendents who couldn't understand this point simply couldn't sense the power of those transcendent transcendents at the level of the six tribulation. Therefore, even though the six tribulation experts behaved very differently from before, their presences rapidly receding and they gradually faded into the crowd, the ordinary transcendent transcendents did not have much of a reaction. None of the transcendent transcendents who had placed their hopes on them were dissatisfied with their vanishing into the crowd. At this time, compared to ordinary transcendent transcendents, these transcendent transcendents at the sixth tribulation level were even more transcendent. Therefore, they could easily see the essence of this wondrous world in front of them and know what its source was. At this time, all the fluctuations completely disappeared. As for the baleful aura that had just appeared, it seemed to have disappeared into nothingness once again. However, the weakened evil aura seemed to have turned into another wondrous form, fusing with the endless world and this wondrous world. In other words, it had turned into a wondrous bridge that connected this wondrous world and the endless world. Make your choice. All the transcendent experts received this prompt at this instant. This prompt was extremely cold, as if it was made up of the sounds of nature. There wasn't the slightest bit of emotion in it. Choose your path and practice it. If you succeed, you will transcend. If you fail, the world will collapse. Then, such an explanation appeared in the minds of the transcendents. After that, millions of paths appeared in front of the transcendents. In the eyes of the transcendents, these millions of paths were incomparably wondrous. They seemed to be great Daos that could lead to a supreme realm that was countless times more powerful than their current realm. However, none of the transcendents felt happy when they saw these paths. On the contrary, they all felt their hair stand on end. They felt that this was the greatest evil in the world. What was this? Even the most ignorant transcendent experts knew that whether it was the number or the aura, these were the paths that the transcendent experts of the fifth tribulation level had explored to reach the sixth tribulation level. Naturally, the essence of these paths was extremely high. For them, who had transcended four tribulations, or even less, they were naturally the great Tao that led to the heavens. They could reach heights that they could not even imagine, elevating their essence to a level that they could not comprehend at all. However, everyone clearly knew that even the fifth tribulation cultivators themselves couldn't walk on these paths. They were the pioneers of these paths, and they were the existences that were most compatible with these paths. However, even they couldn't walk on these incomparably wondrous paths. They were far inferior to the fifth tribulation experts, and they weren't compatible with these paths either. How could they walk on these paths? The world will collapse. Does this mean that if we can't walk on these paths, our world will completely collapse? A transcendent said with an unsightly expression. As a transcendent being, Their thoughts were naturally not something an ordinary person could imagine. Although it was only a few words, it was enough for them to understand many things that they didn't know before. Once someone explained it, the other transcendents who were still confused would naturally be able to see the truth that they couldn't see before. Therefore, very soon, all the transcendents understood that this was the meaning of those words. Some of the more perceptive ones even vaguely felt that their world was already tied to them, and their fates were connected. Those transcending existences looked at each other and shivered. The supreme transcendence in this strange world included all the supreme transcendence in the endless heavens and earth. In other words, as long as they were supreme transcendence, they would appear in this strange world right now. If it was really as they thought, that all the paths were impossible to succeed, then after this tribulation, almost half of the worlds in the endless world would be completely destroyed. It went without saying how great the loss would be for the endless world. It could be said that once this result appeared, it meant that the possibility of the endless world surviving the second tribulation had become extremely small. Losing almost half of the world would damage the balance of the endless world. It was simply unimaginable. It could be said that the imbalance of the remaining worlds in the endless world was enough to form an unimaginable disaster that would shake the remaining worlds. Not to mention that although this strange world seemed so dangerous, it was only the first wave of the second endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. Even in the world, it was impossible for a cultivator to only encounter a single tribulation. Moreover, this was a terrifying tribulation that spread across the endless world. No matter how terrifying the tribulations they'd encountered were, or how horrifying the consequences were, it was only the first wave of challenges to the boundless heavens and the earth. Next, there would be an endless stream of challenges. Is this the second endless tribulation of heaven and earth? A transcendent of the fourth tribulation sighed. This sigh made all the transcendents feel as if these words had come from the bottom of their hearts, and all of them felt a sense of sorrow in their hearts. At this time, the transcendent experts at the sixth tribulation level all frowned. The path chosen was also targeted at them. Even though they were sixth tribulation experts and had already experienced the range of these paths, they were no exception. And the reason why they felt a headache was because they had already experienced the range of these paths. Compared to the other supreme transcendents, the sixth tribulation experts did not have much of an advantage in choosing a path. In fact, they were even at a slight disadvantage. The fundamental reason was none other than the fact that their Tao path had already surpassed these Tao paths. These paths were like pipes. For those transcendent experts at the fourth tribulation level, these pipes were as huge as stars. They could easily step into them and move forward along them. However, if that was the case, it would be as difficult as asking a normal living being to move the stars once they reached the end of the tunnel. But at the very least, they could easily step into the pipes to the sixth tribulation experts. These pipes were as small as water pipes. It was not a problem for water to flow through such a small pipe, but if they wanted them to crawl into it and advance along the pipe, it was obviously making things difficult for them. Hence, at this moment, faced with such a choice, they suddenly realized that they had fallen into an inexplicable, awkward situation. Chapter 3180. At this time, a fourth tribulation expert suddenly transmitted his voice to the entire world. Don't choose a path. We need to find the right path first. Many people who had transcended had a slight change in their expressions when they heard those words. Most of them were pleasantly surprised, but a small portion of them were hesitant. The transcendent transcendents who were pleasantly surprised were obviously the ones who didn't think too deeply about it. Because they didn't think too much about it, they still had hope in their hearts. They just felt that what the transcendent expert said was reasonable and had a high chance of success. Only the small number of transcending realm experts who were deep in thought knew that this matter was easy to say, but the difficulty of doing it was unimaginably high. Putting everything else aside, it would be a huge challenge to explore the correct path. These paths were the paths explored by fifth tribulation experts. Even the path they had explored was full of detours and traps. Under such circumstances, how could they, who were far weaker than the 5 tribulations, find the correct path so easily? If the right path could appear so easily, why would they have to wait until now to explore it? Moreover, this was only the difficulty of finding the right path. Even if the right path appeared, would they be able to walk it? The difficulty of a cultivator's advancement was constantly increasing. In other words, every time they advanced to the next realm, a large number of cultivators would be eliminated. It was the same no matter what realm they were at. Even tribulation experts were no exception. Under such circumstances, there were fewer second tribulation experts than tribulation experts. The third tribulation experts were fewer than the second tribulation experts, and the 4 tribulation experts were fewer than the third tribulation experts. In the same way, out of 10,000 tribulations, one of them would be able to reach the 5th tribulation. This was an unimaginably high probability. But now, the number of transcendent experts who hadn't reached the tribulation realm had to be counted in the hundreds of millions. Even if the right path was right in front of them, how many of them were qualified to walk it? Was there a need to say what the result would be if they couldn't walk it? Facing such a situation, how could these transcendent experts who were deep in thought not worry? Of course, even if they were worried, they didn't directly voice their worries at this time. After all, confidence was extremely important to everyone at this time. If he was confident, then there was still room for discussion and anticipation. But if he didn't even have that last bit of confidence, then everything would be over, of course. There were those who had transcended the world who had thought a bit more deeply, and their hearts were instead filled with anticipation. Although they were able to think of all the things mentioned above, compared to the transcendents who had begun to despair after thinking about it, their thoughts were even darker and more infuriating. They had even considered the boundless heavenly tribulation itself. This was a tribulation, not the wrath of the heavens, not a heavenly punishment. Compared to the latter two, the former two left more life force for the existence undergoing the tribulation. If things went as he had expected, then not many of the transcendent cultivators would be able to walk that path, even if it was the correct path. If that was the case, this tribulation would be able to cause the entire boundless world to perish completely. Everything in the boundless world would be annihilated by this tribulation. After all, if they could walk this path from the 5th tribulation to the 6th tribulation, then how could they still be existences below the 4th tribulation? They would have become 5th tribulation experts a long time ago, or even 6th tribulation experts. Based on this standard, it was possible that none of the transcendent cultivators in this world would be able to complete the requirements of this tribulation. If that was the case, then the amount of life force left behind by this tribulation for the transcendent cultivators and the boundless world would be too small. This amount of life force was so small that it was hard for them to believe that it was a tribulation's life force. Thus, these transcendents who were thinking more deeply had an indescribable expectation in their hearts. They were looking forward to the conditions that might appear next that could bring them even more chances of survival. They knew that it was very likely that such conditions would appear. As long as such conditions appeared, it meant that they would be able to find a way to get around the various restrictions they had encountered, allowing them to walk the correct path. The transcendent cultivators all had different expressions and attitudes, but they were all gathering their strength for this tribulation. Don't you have any ideas? Finally, a 4th tribulation expert reluctantly asked a 6th tribulation expert who had transcended the world. There were simply too many transcending experts at the 6th tribulation level. With so many of them, even if they were distributed across the boundless world, there would still be a considerable amount of them. Under such a high density, it was not difficult to encounter a transcendent at the 6th tribulation level. It could be said that any transcendent cultivator could easily find one in no time or distance if they wanted to. The 6th tribulation cultivator sighed and said, "How much better do you think our situation is compared to yours? For you, at least there is a path to walk. But for us, what appears in front of us is only a small water pipe." The transcendent, who was at the 4th tribulation level, didn't seem to care. He naturally knew that this tribulation had no effect on a 6th tribulation expert. Now that the path in front of him had become a small water pipe, He was somewhat surprised, but that was all. Although he did not expect there to be such an obstacle, he had already known that there would be some obstacles. At this time, it was only something that he had expected to appear in a slightly unexpected manner. Under such circumstances, how could he show any signs of surprise? At this time, he said, "These are only small water pipes. Don't tell me you have no way to help us choose the true path to heaven?" The sixth tribulation cultivator frowned. Theoretically speaking, they did have the ability to do so. Among the millions of paths, which were especially small and which were relatively large, were naturally a secret to ordinary, transcendent cultivators. However, to them, it was something that could be seen with a single glance. In this case, if the sixth tribulation cultivator wanted to help other transcendent cultivators choose their path, he only needed to give them a few pointers and the danger would be reduced by many times. But could they really do that? Was this kind of pointers really allowed by the endless tribulations? If they gave pointers, would the endless world think that they were too involved and raise the intensity of the tribulation, bringing danger to them? He sighed and said, "Although we can, I don't dare to take the risk." Why? The fourth tribulation cultivator frowned. Because if we help, the power of this tribulation might increase exponentially. At that time, no matter who it is, the danger will be countless times greater than it is now. The sixth tribulation cultivator sighed. It will happen just by helping? The fourth tribulation cultivator showed a shocked expression. Of course not. It's just that there is this danger. But do you dare to take this risk? The sixth tribulation cultivator sighed. The fourth tribulation cultivator was silent. Indeed, he didn't dare to take the risk. But if that's the case, I don't know how many fellow cultivators and worlds will be sacrificed to find the correct path. The fourth tribulation cultivator sighed after a long time. At this moment, a voice rang in the fourth tribulation cultivator's ears. It was a powerful cultivator with a deep relationship with him. He was rather ashamed and wanted to pull him into the vanguard and let him participate in the first exploration of the millions of paths. In other words, he was asked to sacrifice his life and everything in his world for the sake of finding the correct path for those who came after him. It really is. The fourth tribulation cultivator sighed. It would be a lie to say that he didn't hesitate. How could he not hesitate when faced with a decision that would place his life and everything in his world on the scale? How could he really be as duty-bound as the legends say? His heart was naturally filled with countless struggles, battles, and all sorts of messy thoughts. But even so, in the end, he still sighed and nodded. He responded to the fellow cultivator with a deep relationship and decided to participate. Of course, what he was thinking about wasn't really that great. It was just that compared to what he cared about, he felt that he could still reluctantly accept giving up so much. Of course, after making this decision, he didn't feel relieved. He felt like he had achieved some sort of sublimation. If it was just sacrificing himself, he would naturally feel that way. Unfortunately, the decision he made at this moment wasn't just about sacrificing himself. He was also sacrificing what he cared about the most, his world, as well as everything he cared about in his world. Under such circumstances, he made such a decision out of shame and reluctance. He was ashamed of his own world, and he was ashamed of everything that he cared about that he had also placed on the sacrificial altar. He was even reluctant to part with everything. At this moment, in the eyes of the sixth tribulation cultivator, the light on the fourth tribulation cultivator seemed to be much purer and more resplendent. This was the light of sacrifice. It was a pure light that had fused everything into an unimaginably great goal. No matter how many times one saw this light, it was still shocking. If I can't survive this tribulation in this endless world, then it's definitely fate. At this moment, this thought flashed through the sixth tribulation cultivator's mind. At that moment, he raised his head and looked over. There were countless places in the world that had similar lights exploding out of nowhere. The eruption of each ball of light clearly meant that a transcendent expert had decided to sacrifice his everything. These densely packed lights represented that there were countless supreme, transcendent cultivators who were willing to sacrifice themselves and everything they cared about for this endless world and for all life that would come after them. Even though their hearts were filled with struggle and reluctance to part with each other. Normally, for many sixth tribulation cultivators, this endless world was just a very ordinary group of worlds. They didn't feel that there was any difference between this group of worlds and other groups of worlds. However, when this endless world was in danger, no matter how many times it was, they would feel an indescribable shock in their hearts. All the living beings in the endless world, the experts, the cultivators, the brilliant souls, the unimaginable awareness, and the attitude of sacrifice after encountering a disaster all shocked the sixth tribulation experts who were watching all of this. At the bottom of it all of this had actually been predestined since the moment the boundless world had chosen its path. After all, what kind of existences could truly transcend the world and see the endless world? They were all supreme, transcendent cultivators. As supreme, transcendent cultivators, they had things they couldn't let go of. They were even willing to give up on transcending to protect all sorts of things. Under such circumstances, it was destined that these supreme, transcendent cultivators had stronger emotions than ordinary cultivators. This meant that they had deeper feelings for this endless world than ordinary cultivators. With deep and strong emotions, they were naturally more willing to sacrifice themselves when encountering danger. Of course, this was not a certainty. Not every transcendent being would be willing to sacrifice for the boundless world. They would be willing to give up everything they cared about. However, among the countless supreme, transcendent cultivators, there would always be a large portion who were willing to do so. As long as there was a certain number of supreme, transcendent cultivators who were willing to sacrifice themselves, then the situation in this endless world would naturally be reversed. This would naturally display a special characteristic that would shock the sixth tribulation cultivators. It would make this endless world different from all other groups of worlds, making it the most special place in the hearts of many sixth tribulation cultivators. Perhaps we can also think of a way to participate. Although too much participation will increase the power of the tribulations, a limited participation might still be possible. The sixth tribulation cultivator who was conversing with the fourth tribulation cultivator thought to himself. Chapter 31:81. Since a sixth tribulation transcendent decided to participate, he naturally couldn't just sit back and watch. With a sway of his body, he followed the fourth tribulation expert and disappeared from that location. The fourth tribulation transcendent who decided to sacrifice themselves and their world naturally didn't have anything else to do after deciding to participate. In fact, after they decided to participate in the sacrifice, they would directly disappear from their original positions and head to a special secret realm that many transcendents had opened up in this world. As transcendent experts, each of them had at least opened up their own world. For such existences, it was not difficult at all for them to open up some sort of mystic realm in a certain world. Even if they were alone, it wouldn't be difficult for them to do this. Not to mention, it wasn't just one person taking action. There were countless fourth tribulation transcendent experts, third tribulation transcendent experts, second tribulation transcendent experts, and even tribulation transcendent experts working together. Under these circumstances, even if the world before them was so special that it was completely under the control of the endless tribulations, they could still open up a secret realm. When the sixth tribulation transcendent stepped into the secret realm, he discovered that the number of cultivators inside exceeded his expectations. Among them, only the fourth tribulation transcendent made up half of them. The rest weren't below the fourth tribulation transcendent. They were all sixth tribulation transcendent experts. So everyone has the same mentality as me. Looking at the other six tribulation transcendent experts, the sixth tribulation transcendent only smiled faintly. He already understood what was going on. Clearly, the decision of the fourth tribulation transcendent experts didn't just shock him. Not only was he moved and wanted to help them, but the other six tribulation transcendent experts were also shocked and moved by them. They wanted to help them as well. When the other six tribulation transcendent experts saw him, faint traces of joy appeared in their eyes. Although one more sixth tribulation transcendent wouldn't make much of a difference to the overall situation, having one more person participating meant that their choice was recognized by more people. This was naturally something to be happy about. This sixth tribulation transcendent wasn't the last to enter the secret realm. It was just like how the fourth tribulation expert, who came in with the sixth tribulation expert, was not the last one who was willing to sacrifice himself. Afterwards, there were still some fourth tribulation experts who entered the secret plane one after another. Similarly, there were also some sixth tribulation experts who entered the secret plane one after another. Of course, not every fourth tribulation expert could move a sixth tribulation expert and make them follow them in. After all, not every fourth tribulation expert would dare to question a sixth tribulation expert. If he didn't question them, he wouldn't have much interaction with a sixth tribulation expert. Without much communication, how could those sixth tribulation experts follow him into the secret realm? The reason why they had entered the secret realm was because they were moved by the sacrifices of the numerous transcendents and decided to help them. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for them to enter at the same frequency as the fourth tribulation experts. As for the frequency of their actions, it would depend on how fast they made their decisions and how much they were touched by it. A fourth tribulation expert came up to the sixth tribulation experts and asked loudly, "Do you have anything to teach us?" This fourth tribulation expert was the one who suggested all of this. He was also the one who first decided to sacrifice himself to explore the path. Moreover, he was also the one who told the transcendents not to choose their path so quickly and to wait for the path to be explored. The sixth tribulation experts smiled faintly. One of them said, "You guys do it first. When we can participate, we will naturally participate." Hearing this, the fourth tribulation expert was somewhat disappointed. However, it was clear that he did not place his hopes on them. Hence, he was not too surprised to hear such a reply from them. Then, he nodded and said to the six tribulation experts, "Then I'll leave it to you all." Then, he ignored the other six tribulation experts and began to summon the fourth tribulation experts for an extremely intense discussion. What happened next concerned the lives of all of them, as well as the life and death of the world that they cared about. Under such circumstances, even if these fourth tribulation experts were willing to sacrifice themselves and their world, they wouldn't want their sacrifices to be in vain. Hence, at this juncture where they were about to take action, every single one of them naturally had their own thoughts and attitudes. With different thoughts and attitudes, they naturally had their own insistence. As for other people's thoughts and attitudes, they naturally had their own disagreements. In this case, when they were deciding what to do next, they naturally hoped that their own thoughts would take up a greater weight. They wanted things to develop more in line with their own thoughts, their own expectations. Because of this, arguments were naturally unavoidable. Of course, all the fourth tribulation experts here were willing to sacrifice themselves. They were all fearless existences. Even though there were tens of millions of them, and they were arguing about something crucial to their lives, these fourth tribulation experts still showed considerable restraint. However, these fourth tribulation experts still showed considerable restraint at this moment. Furthermore, the speed at which they gave up on their own thoughts and opinions was also thousands of times faster than usual. Every time a fourth tribulation expert felt that his emotions weren't quite right and that some sort of obsession was about to form, he would take the initiative to take a step back. Although he wouldn't give up his own thoughts, ideas, and plans, he would still eventually regain his rationality at the critical juncture. This degree of restraint was somewhat beyond imagination. At least, it was something that the six tribulation experts couldn't have imagined before. In fact, many of the six tribulation experts here were here to suppress the fourth tribulation experts when they lost their minds and were controlled by the tribulations. That was why they were here. Now that they saw that the fourth tribulation experts actually had unimaginable restraint and displayed extraordinary rationality, they were naturally a little surprised. However, they quickly understood what was going on. Even the six tribulation experts, who hadn't experienced the previous endless world tribulation, knew what it was like through various means. As a result, They easily guessed that the reason why these fourth tribulation cultivators had such extraordinary rationality was because they had learned their lesson from the last endless tribulation. They knew what would happen if they lost their rationality and gave birth to obsessions. Of course, it was also because these fourth tribulation experts could so easily give up their obsession. If it was an ordinary transcendent, they wouldn't be able to do this so easily. Even if they had the experience of the previous endless world tribulation, even if they knew what was the most reasonable thing to do, they wouldn't be able to do it so easily. After all, some things couldn't be done just because they knew it. Everyone knew that one had to be diligent in order to succeed, but how many people couldn't be diligent? Only these transcendent experts, who had already sacrificed themselves and everything they cared about, could truly do this. After all, they had already decided to sacrifice so much. It was easy to imagine how much mental struggle they had gone through before this. Under such mental struggles, they had naturally thought through everything. What else couldn't they give up? Their own obsession, their own point of view, their own thoughts, their own wishes, their own desires, their own goals. As long as it was useless, they wouldn't hesitate to abandon it. As long as others could prove this point, all of the four tribulation experts naturally had their own problems, but at the same time, all of the four tribulation experts had their own merits and their essence. It's impossible to choose the correct path from there, but it should be possible to choose the path that's easiest to modify. In the end, all of them decided on their final goal. Of the millions of paths, none of them was truly the correct path. Even if he could reach the sixth tribulation in the end, there would be many detours, and many hidden dangers would be left behind. Even a true fifth tribulation expert would face great risks on such a path, let alone them. However, even if it was impossible to find the correct path, it didn't mean that they couldn't think of a way. Even if they couldn't directly make the path they deduced appear in the choices given by the heavens and earth, they could make some special changes to modify the path they had chosen. In that case, as long as the modification method was good enough, they would eventually reach their desired goal. To achieve this, there was a precondition. The modification had to conform to the overall framework of the path they had chosen. If it didn't conform to the framework, then it would be a new path instead of following the original path. But did such a path exist? How could there not be such a path among the millions of paths? In fact, among the millions of paths, there were countless paths that could be slightly adjusted and adjusted accordingly. It was just that some of them could accommodate smaller adjustments, while some could accommodate larger adjustments. What they needed to do now was to choose a path that could accommodate the adjustments they wanted, and the path wouldn't be too crooked. As long as they chose such a path, then they could start modifying the path. There were millions of fourth tribulation experts. As long as each of them discovered a wrong modification method, they would eventually be able to obtain the correct one. After that, they only needed to spread the correct modification method, and their mission would be considered complete. At that time, the many transcendents in this world, as well as the many worlds in the endless heavens and earth, would finally be safe. Seeing that the fourth tribulation experts had finally come to such a conclusion, those who understood the situation felt that they had gained a lot. After all, although the sixth tribulation experts were rather outstanding, they actually had their own problems. The problem was that the paths they had chosen were far too small for them. They were so small that it was difficult for them to pass, even if they had to suffer. Under such circumstances, although the endless heavenly tribulations wouldn't harm them enough to truly kill them, it would still make all their hard work in the endless heavens and earth go up in smoke. In this case, they naturally had to think of ways to find a path that they could pass through. As for how to find these paths that they could pass through, they were actually very confused. Under such circumstances, the method that the fourth tribulation experts had found was clearly a great revelation for them. For the sixth tribulation experts, they could tell at a glance which paths had many detours, which paths had a broken future, and which paths could be considered correct with just a little modification. After all, they had already gone through this stage. Under such circumstances, if they only needed to find the correct path, they could naturally choose any path they wanted. However, it was clear that just the correct path was not enough for them to pass through. Therefore, at this time, what they needed to find was a path that was large enough to barely allow them to pass through after modification. Although this was troublesome, compared to before, it was still a huge improvement, turning the impossible into the possible. Increasing the size of the path seemed a bit heaven-defying at first glance. However, since modification could turn a wrong path into a correct path, then modifying the size of the path to be even larger would obviously not be a problem. Compared to the fourth tribulation experts, the advantage of the sixth tribulation experts was that they had their own evaluation of each path. At this moment, while the fourth tribulation powerhouses were still confused about which path they should choose, the sixth tribulation powerhouses had already chosen the path that suited them the best out of the millions of paths. Then, hundreds of sixth tribulation experts chose that path at the same time. In an instant, countless fourth tribulation experts looked at them and instantly understood many things. Chapter 3182. These six tribulation experts didn't communicate much with each other, let alone have a meeting to discuss anything. Calm, however, they were not at all surprised that many of their fellow Taoists would do the same thing as them, because every single one of them was doing this for the same reason. They wanted to demonstrate to the four tribulation experts so that they could understand which path was suitable for them. Doing this could be said to be skirting the boundaries. After all, they couldn't participate too much in the endless tribulations of the world. Once they did, they would trigger a new round of changes in the tribulations of the world. In the end, the tribulations of the world would develop to a point where they could truly threaten them. However, it was obvious that they didn't want to sit back and do nothing. Otherwise, they wouldn't have appeared in this secret realm. Under such circumstances, they could only use the least amount of action that would trigger the endless tribulations of the world in order to help the fourth tribulation powerhouses. Clearly, their current actions belong to this category. These six tribulation experts all knew how famous each other's methods were, so they naturally knew. Obviously, they weren't the only ones who could think of things that they could think of. No matter how brilliant the method was, as long as they could think of it, many of their peers would think of it too. In this way, it was only natural that hundreds of fellow Taoists would make the same decision at the same time. In fact, to a certain extent, the number of six tribulation experts who made such a choice was actually quite small. Although the four tribulation experts were like ants compared to the six tribulation experts, they were still incredible existences who could cultivate from zero to their current level. How could they not see such an obvious hint? At this moment, they all understood that this scene was obviously a hint from the six tribulation powerhouses. The path they had chosen was obviously the most suitable path that they had discussed with the others. At this moment, they discovered an inexplicable fact that made them feel astonished. At this moment, the six tribulation experts who had chosen their path all experienced a huge change. Every single six tribulation expert's aura began to weaken rapidly. Unknowingly, they had already weakened to a level that was tens of thousands of times weaker than before. They had just stepped into the fifth tribulation level. Will it definitely be weakened by so many times? Or will we stand at the beginning of the path we choose? At this moment, this thought flashed through the minds of many fourth tribulation experts. If it was the first situation, it would naturally be a fact that would make them feel despair. After all, they were far too weak compared to that path. If it was weakened by tens of thousands of times, how could they have any chance of success on that path? However, if it was the second situation, then things would be different. If it was the second situation, then it could be said to be the only chance of survival left to them in the endless heavenly tribulation. Choosing a path was equivalent to stepping on the beginning of that path. Compared to slowly improving oneself to the beginning of that path, the effect would naturally be many times worse. If they really cultivated and continued to grow with this kind of foundation, then they would obviously collapse after reaching a certain level and die without a burial place. However, if it was just to walk the path they had chosen, this situation was obviously enough to give many fourth tribulation experts a chance of success. Although a fourth tribulation expert was still far inferior to a fifth tribulation expert, which was the beginning of that path, the difference was still too great. It was as difficult as a child swinging a sledgehammer for a fourth tribulation expert to understand the realm of a fifth tribulation expert with their own realm. However, no matter what, they still improved from being unable to swing a sledgehammer to being able to swing a sledgehammer. Even though it seemed more dangerous this way, they could still use the sledgehammer to achieve something that they could not previously achieve. Obviously, this could be called a chance of survival. At this moment, many fourth tribulation experts felt that their plan seemed to need to be reformulated. Since they had such an advantage, should they slightly change the previous decision of choosing the path that could allow the most modification? However, after thinking about it, those fourth tribulation experts finally sighed and decided to continue with their previous decision. Although there was a little more chance of survival compared to before, this chance was still insignificant compared to the difficulty. Under such circumstances, if they chose other methods, the probability of failure was still far greater than the method they had discussed previously. Even if the overall probability was actually a little higher than before, under such circumstances, it was needless to say what choice to make. At this moment, compared to those fourth tribulation experts who were pleasantly surprised but still inexplicably worried, those sixth tribulation experts were already overjoyed. Previously, they had their own ideas and had a certain degree of confidence that they could barely complete this wave of tribulations. However, it was still too troublesome, and the probability of them paying a huge price in the end was not small. It was just that because they had no other choice, they had no choice but to choose this method that had a high probability of success. However, what they discovered now made them understand that perhaps this endless tribulation of the world still left them with enough chance of survival. If choosing a path could allow them to stand at the beginning of the path, then to them, this wave of tribulations was almost no longer a threat. After all, this situation was equivalent to reducing their size to a height that could allow them to pass through the water pipe after choosing a path. This way, for them, the obstacles that originally prevented them from passing through the path were naturally completely gone. Without such obstacles, for those six tribulation experts who had already experienced 5 tribulations to 6 tribulations, how difficult would it be to walk this path again? Of course, they could walk through it with their eyes closed. Just like at this moment, the hundreds of six tribulation experts who had chosen a path started to show countless phenomena. These phenomena were strange, and they rose and fell one after another. It was as if a large number of phenomena had been suppressed for a long time and then completely erupted in an instant. As these phenomena continued to appear, the auras of those six tribulation experts started to rise continuously. Just by looking at them with the naked eye, one could tell that their realms were rising steadily. One could also understand that they were now slowly moving towards the end of the path they had chosen. As for why the phenomena were different, it was naturally because in the process of their cultivation, they had made certain modifications to the path they had chosen. Because of their modifications, even though the paths they chose were the same, the final outcome was completely different from the one they had chosen. Instead, it was like there were many different paths. Before long, even before those 4 tribulation experts had truly recovered from their shock, the 6 tribulation experts had already disappeared from this secret realm like smoke. Of course, at the same time, they had also disappeared from the world constructed by the endless tribulation of the world. Clearly, they had easily passed through the first wave of the endless tribulation of the world. They succeeded so easily. At this moment, those 4 tribulation experts who saw this scene were truly envious and shocked. At the same time, they felt an inexplicable sense of gratitude towards those 6 tribulation experts. At the last moment, those 6 tribulation experts still used various methods to demonstrate to them how to modify the path, how to change it into the correct path that they could walk through by themselves. After all, cultivation itself was an extremely secretive matter. If they didn't intentionally conceal it, how could there be such obvious phenomena during the cultivation process of those 6 tribulation experts? Even if there would definitely be some phenomena during the cultivation process, it wouldn't be so dense and obvious. Obviously, such a situation would only occur if they were intentionally demonstrating. I'll go first. At this moment, a four tribulation expert sighed and said to the others. The other four tribulation experts looked at him with different expressions. Some seemed to want to say something, but in the end, they opened their mouths and didn't really say anything. In the end, one of them said to that person, "Please." That person smiled and said, "If I succeed, then I will be the first to escape. If I fail, then what happens next will have nothing to do with me. It can be said that no matter what, I will escape from the sea of suffering. Instead, you guys will still have to suffer in the sea of suffering." As he said that, he laughed and chose the path that the six tribulation experts suggested to them without hesitation. As he chose this path, his aura began to expand crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had already expanded by tens of thousands of times. From an ordinary fourth tribulation expert, he instantly rose to the level of a fifth tribulation expert who was above all fourth tribulation experts. Moreover, the nature of his aura also began to undergo various indescribable changes. It was as if he had suddenly changed from his original normal appearance to another cultivation path. This feeling is very strange. It doesn't feel superficial at all. Also, some strange memories have appeared in my heart. Although my original cultivation memories aren't completely suppressed, they are separated by a layer. It feels like I've been walking this path from the beginning. The fourth tribulation expert murmured. He seemed to be talking to himself, but also seemed to be explaining to the other cultivators. The other four tribulation experts all focused their attention at this moment. They carefully observed every detail of the fourth tribulation expert and every change in his aura. They engraved every word that the fourth tribulation expert said into their hearts. They didn't dare to forget even a single tone. They knew very well that the fourth tribulation expert was using his own life and the world as the price to explore the path for them. If they wasted this sacrifice, then even they wouldn't be able to forgive themselves. Therefore, at this moment, all of them buried all of their distracting thoughts. They used all of their energy and attention to remember everything that the fourth tribulation expert had done. The fourth tribulation expert didn't care about what the others thought. At this moment, he had already devoted himself to that path. Although he was determined to sacrifice himself to explore the path for everyone, this didn't mean that he would really throw away his life. Even in this extremely dangerous situation, he was still doing everything he could to find the hope of survival, to find a way to walk the path. Truly stepping onto the path is easier than I imagined. Moreover, the initial increase doesn't seem to be difficult. He continued talking as if he was talking to himself. He tried his best to describe every feeling he had. There were so many fourth tribulation and sixth tribulation experts in this secret realm. However, at this moment, there was no other sound in the entire secret realm apart from the fourth tribulation expert talking to himself. It could be said that just by listening to the sound, no one would think that there were millions of fourth tribulation and sixth tribulation experts in the secret realm. Everyone would only think that the fourth tribulation expert who was talking to himself was alone in this secret realm. The process of cultivation was naturally extremely complicated. No matter how simple it was, it couldn't be explained clearly in a few words. This was especially true for the fourth tribulation expert who was walking on a completely new and unfamiliar path. During the process of cultivation, he explained everything that he had come into contact with about this path in detail. Moreover, he didn't hide the operation of his own power, and magic at all. Other than the things that couldn't be left behind, everything else was completely displayed to the fourth tribulation experts. It could be said that he had done almost everything he could do. Time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, a few days had passed. If it was a sixth tribulation expert, a few days would probably be enough for them to walk this path tens of thousands of times. However, for these four tribulation experts, these few days could at most be considered as the beginning of cultivation. After all, even if they were given a cultivation foundation by the endless tribulation of the universe and could directly start on that path, they were still fourth tribulation experts after all. In the end, it was still rather difficult for them to surpass a realm. In fact, if it wasn't for the endless heavenly tribulations giving them a chance to live and giving them the foundation to walk this path, even such a difficult outcome would not have happened. Chapter 3183. Fortunately, the fourth tribulation experts had already expected this. When they constructed this secret realm, they had already set up the flow of time in the secret realm. As a result, this secret realm could accelerate the flow of time to an extremely high level when they needed it. And this was obviously the time when they needed it. Of course, this kind of acceleration wouldn't come without a price. After all, this world wasn't an ordinary one. It was a world created by endless tribulations. Although such a heaven and earth left many transcendents a chance of survival, it was impossible for everything to go according to the wishes of those transcendents. Thus, this world naturally rejected adjusting the flow of time, which was extremely beneficial to the transcendent experts' cultivation. It wasn't impossible for the transcendent experts to resist this rejection, but the price they had to pay was clearly not something that could be compared to adjusting the flow of time in an ordinary world. Otherwise, why would they have waited until the fourth tribulation expert began to cultivate to accelerate time? Why didn't they accelerate time to the limit earlier? If they had more time to discuss the things they had discussed earlier, wouldn't it be even better? At this time, in the secret realm, in order to maintain the flow of time that was tens of millions of times faster than the outside world, almost every transcendent expert spent at least 30% of their energy on it. Moreover, it was an endless process, not a one-off process. It could be said that the fourth tribulation expert was sacrificing himself for everyone else. But in fact, everyone was putting in a part of their effort. Even if the other's sacrifice was far less than the fourth tribulation experts, time passed bit by bit. The content of the fourth tribulation expert's explanation became more and more profound. If all the content was compiled into a book, even a large library wouldn't be able to contain it. However, even so, the distance he had traveled on the path was only equivalent to 30%. The reason why he brought it up at this time wasn't because it had any special meaning. Instead, it was because the fourth tribulation expert was running out of energy at this point. His progress had gradually stagnated, and it was difficult for him to continue breaking through. In the end, when the fourth tribulation expert took the last step he could take, an indescribable sorrow rose in the hearts of the transcendent experts. Then, the fourth tribulation expert sighed and turned to look at the transcendent experts. He said, "I'll leave the rest to you." As he spoke, his body shuddered. The endless power he had accumulated in the secret plane for hundreds of thousands of years using the Tao path exploded in an instant. Not only did it destroy him into nothingness, but it also used the connection between him and the world he was in to transmit it to the world he cared about. It destroyed everything in that world as well, causing that world to turn from an extremely prosperous state into an empty shell in the blink of an eye. An empty shell of a world. Although the fourth tribulation expert had only walked a third of the path, it was still nothing compared to the overall path. There was still a long way to go to the end. The further one went on the path, the greater the gap caused by a little bit of distance. Looking at it from a linear perspective, 1/3 was indeed not a small amount. However, if one considered it from a perspective of the path, this was only equivalent to just starting out. The gap from truly walking the path was enough to shock anyone. Ignoring everything else, even if one walked the last step and was only a sliver away from the end, there was still a world of difference between walking the path and truly walking it. From this, one could see how much a third of the path was. However, even if this third was so small, it was still the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation. For existences at the fourth tribulation level, any small increase in strength on this path would be earth-shattering. Not to mention a third of the way, even a little bit of it would be enough to easily crush thousands of peak fourth tribulation experts, let alone a third of it. Under such circumstances, the boundless power gathered by the fourth tribulation expert who walked a third of the path exploded in an instant. The impact of that was self-evident, completely annihilating the fourth tribulation expert. and then using this annihilation to transmit the power to the world. Completely annihilating the world was only a basic operation. Fortunately, under the mechanism of the endless tribulations, this release was extremely concentrated. Under this concentration, even if the boundless power exploded near them, it would only destroy the body of the fourth tribulation powerhouse and the world around it. It would not affect the other fourth tribulation powerhouses around them. For the other four tribulation experts, everything that happened before their eyes was just an extremely tragic drama. There were no real injuries. So this is how the world is destroyed. Many of the fourth tribulation experts were sad and angry, but they also had an inexplicable realization. The sacrifice of the fourth tribulation expert allowed them to see many things that were only theoretical before. At this moment, they felt that their understanding of the endless tribulations was much deeper than before. Damn it! A fourth tribulation expert suppressed his boundless anger and roared. This curse resonated with all the fourth tribulation powerhouses. However, it was clear that the other four tribulation powerhouses didn't vent their emotions like he did. At this moment, a four tribulation expert said, "I comprehended something before. Let me continue." Seeing this fourth tribulation expert, the other fourth tribulation experts had anticipation in their eyes, but also hesitation. This fourth tribulation expert was recognized as one of the few with the greatest potential among all the fourth tribulation experts. Although there was no ranking list like in other worlds, all the four tribulation experts believed that if there really was such a ranking list, this four tribulation expert would definitely be one of them. Under such circumstances, if a fourth tribulation expert were to embark on that path, almost everyone believed that he would indeed achieve more than an ordinary fourth tribulation expert. He would be able to walk that path to a greater depth. Because of this, they had high expectations for this fourth tribulation expert. But at the same time, because of their belief in this fourth tribulation expert's extraordinary potential, they were still somewhat unwilling to let this fourth tribulation expert try that path at this moment. After all, although they were unwilling to admit it, the truth was that compared to the entire tribulation, this was just the beginning. If he were to be sacrificed here, then when the path was almost completed in the future and they needed someone to take the last step, who could they find? Because of this, they were somewhat hesitant. The fourth tribulation expert did not care about the complicated thoughts of the others. Although the others thought that he had unparalleled potential and should only take the last step, in reality, he did not think that he was better than the other fourth tribulation experts. It was not that he lacked confidence, nor was it because he was modest, but because this was his nature. Perhaps he was stronger than the other fourth tribulation cultivators in some aspects, but what truly made his potential extraordinary was his temperament, his mentality. It was the mentality that he did not think of himself as superior to other cultivators. It was this kind of mentality that gave him extraordinary potential. But it was also this kind of mentality that made him not think that he was better than other cultivators, that he was more important. That was why he directly took action at this moment. He said it now only to inform the other fourth tribulation experts, not to wait for their decision. While the fourth tribulation experts were secretly conflicted, he had already chosen that path. His body erupted with all sorts of incredible auras that would appear when one first stepped on that path. At this moment, the fourth tribulation experts all sighed inwardly. No matter how they struggled and how conflicted, the outcome had already been decided, and it could no longer be changed. At this moment, the fourth tribulation expert with unparalleled potential murmured, "How wonderful! Is this the fifth tribulation realm?" At this moment, he felt an indescribable feeling of enlightenment. It was as if in just an instant, he had obtained endless insights that he had dreamed of countless times in the past. If it was before, he would definitely find an opportunity to properly convert these insights into nutrients for his own path of cultivation. But obviously, the current situation did not give him the opportunity to do so. If he dared to do so, the endless tribulation would dare to directly make him fail. At this moment, he could only sigh and begin to wholeheartedly immerse himself in that path, slowly moving towards the end of the path. Of course, during this process, he also talked nonstop, constantly talking about any changes he encountered in the process of cultivation, as well as all of his insights. Compared to the fourth tribulation expert from before, this fourth tribulation expert was clearly much stronger. The fourth tribulation expert from before was like a mirror, reflecting all sorts of truths. There was not much of his own things mixed in at all. But this fourth tribulation expert was different. During the process of his narration, it was as if he was giving a lecture. Almost all of his knowledge was contained in his narration. Every word, every tone, every action seemed to be demonstrating his path of cultivation to all living beings, demonstrating the supreme principles of the universe. Looking at the fourth tribulation expert's cultivation, many of the fourth tribulation experts only felt that the path of cultivation was unfathomable. The more they listened, the more they felt that it was difficult to reach the end. But at this moment, listening to this fourth tribulation expert's narration, they felt as if they were gradually lifting up a boundless fog, revealing a certain secret hidden behind the fog bit by bit. Faintly, they felt as if their own cultivation realm was also increasing bit by bit. What a pity! At this moment, the fourth tribulation experts, who were originally conflicted, became extremely regretful. With the methods that the fourth tribulation expert had displayed, if he could try that path at the very end, when he was only one step away from success, he might be able to pass through the path in one fell swoop and directly explore the correct path. It would not be like this. No matter how good his performance was, it seemed that he would eventually be stopped at a certain juncture after encountering many obstacles behind him. The fourth tribulation expert, with limitless potential naturally, did not care about the other four tribulation experts' worries. At this moment, he wholeheartedly devoted himself to exploring that path. Bit by bit, he put his own potential and his own knowledge into it, turning all of it into nutrients for that path, pushing himself little by little towards the end of that path. During this process, he could vaguely sense that his path of cultivation seemed to have become purer and more resplendent along with this change. There were faint signs that it was about to directly ascend. However, with this change, he also gradually felt that the resistance he encountered on the path he had chosen was also becoming stronger and stronger. It was as if his path of cultivation was like a stone. As it grew larger and larger, it became more and more difficult to pass through a pipe. Faced with this situation, a thought gradually appeared in the fourth tribulation expert's mind. Perhaps the more imperfect the path of cultivation is, the easier it is to walk through these paths. However, although he realized that the more his path of cultivation improved, the greater the resistance he would face on this path, the fourth tribulation expert still did not turn back. It was not only because this process was out of his control. As long as he continued to walk towards the end of the path, his own path of cultivation would naturally be polished and improved. It was also because, to him, when he decided to try the second path, he had already disregarded his own life and death. Although this situation seemed to inevitably lead to extremely serious consequences, no matter what, it was just him and his own world being destroyed together. And he had already mentally prepared himself for this outcome. Under such circumstances, how could he reject being able to pursue his own path of cultivation before dying and being able to polish his own path of cultivation to a height that he had always dreamed of? Chapter 3184. While the fourth tribulation experts who were determined to sacrifice themselves were working hard in the secret realm, the transcendent experts outside the realm weren't foolishly waiting. Even though the flow of time in the secret realm could be adjusted, it hadn't been long since the fourth tribulation expert told everyone not to choose a path. It had only been a few days. After all, this matter was related to their own lives, and it was even more related to the world that they cared about. How could they really place all their hopes on others? Of course, they would also try their best to find the most perfect path with the most hope of reaching the end. After all, they also knew that the fourth tribulation experts who were determined to sacrifice themselves were helping them. Thus, even though they didn't give up, they still knew that their chances of finding the perfect path couldn't compare to the fourth tribulation experts who were willing to sacrifice themselves. That was why even those who had transcended the world, no matter how confident they were in themselves, did not hastily step onto the path that they felt was perfect. It would be irresponsible not to place all hope on others. However, placing all his hopes on himself was also being irresponsible to himself. Only by being inclusive and not giving up on oneself or rejecting others' help was the correct and positive way to do things. I don't know how far they've progressed. A fourth tribulation expert side. Although a large portion of the fourth tribulation experts had already entered the secret realm to sacrifice themselves. But naturally, it was impossible for all fourth tribulation experts to have such a fearless and sacrificial spirit. Similarly, a large portion of fourth tribulation experts were still outside, working hard in their own way. Suddenly, a fourth tribulation expert said with a strange expression, "Perhaps they've already started to try their paths." Then he sighed, "I can feel that a world has already been completely destroyed." Although they were in this world and were almost completely isolated from the endless world, their world was still in the endless world. In the end, their world was still in the endless world. In the end, they still had an incomparably close connection with it. Thus, even in this part of the world, the transcendent experts who had a deep understanding of their own world could still use it to sense some special changes in the endless world. For example, this fourth tribulation expert was one such transcendent expert. The expressions of the other transcendent experts changed slightly. With the primer, it was much easier for them to sense such movements. It was like a small detail in a complicated painting. If there was no reminder, not many people would notice this small detail. However, if someone were to point out the existence of this small detail, then most people would be able to easily discover the existence of this small detail. It was the same at this time. Without the warning of the fourth tribulation expert, the other transcendent experts would not be able to notice the feedback of the destruction of a certain part of the world that was transmitted from the world that was closely connected to them. However, after being reminded, this feedback that was originally hidden in the endless barriers became quite clear. For a moment, all the transcending experts were silent. After all, the sacrifices of those fourth tribulation cultivators were for them. He knew that the others were determined to sacrifice themselves for him, and he was certain that they had already sacrificed themselves for him. That feeling was obviously completely different. The determination to sacrifice was just an intention. After all, the sacrifice hadn't appeared yet. Those who knew about this would feel a little hesitant. They would faintly feel that the other party might retreat at the last moment. If that was the case, the shock in their hearts would be incomparable to seeing the sacrifice actually appear. Just when the transcendent experts were inwardly shocked, the second sacrifice appeared. The destruction of another part of the world was reflected in their hearts through the endless world's mutual influence. This part of the world is very strong. At this time, many transcendent experts suddenly understood. They could feel that the feedback produced by this newly destroyed part of the world was much stronger than they had imagined. At the very least, it was 1,000 times stronger than the previous world that had been sacrificed. The existence that could create such a part of the world was definitely much stronger than the fourth tribulation expert, who had been the first to be sacrificed. In the end, they weren't completely isolated from the other transcendent experts who had decided to sacrifice themselves. In the end, they were still quite familiar with those transcendents who were determined to sacrifice themselves. Under such circumstances, they only needed to slightly measure the gap between the worlds to make some guesses. They were vaguely sure that the one to be sacrificed was someone they were familiar with, a fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential. Why is it them? The transcendent experts couldn't believe it. They couldn't understand the decision made by the fourth tribulation experts who had decided to sacrifice themselves. Their thoughts were similar to the majority of the fourth tribulation experts in the secret realm. They didn't think that it was a wise choice for the fourth tribulation expert to try so quickly. They also believed that a fourth tribulation expert with that kind of potential should only attempt it when he was close to the end. That was the best choice, and it was clear that this was only the second attempt. No matter how one looked at it, it couldn't be said that this was the end, right? It can't be that the results of their attempt are so gratifying that they're quite confident in their first attempt. Another transcendent expert was looking forward to it. Unfortunately, this expectation was quickly dispelled by them. There was no other reason than that the fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential had failed. If they were really so confident, how could they have failed so easily? Even if there was the factor of time acceleration, this kind of failure was just too natural. How could they still believe that the fourth tribulation expert had made them try? Because they were absolutely confident? While the transcendent experts outside were having wild suspicions, within the secret realm, the fourth tribulation experts were both shocked and regretful. Only a few days had passed in the outside world, but in reality, millions of years had passed in the secret plane thanks to the efforts of the fourth tribulation powerhouses and the help of the sixth tribulation powerhouses, intentionally or unintentionally. This difference in the flow of time was quite shocking to the fourth tribulation experts. They even felt an indescribable sense of accomplishment when they thought about it. However, it was obvious that such a difference in the flow of time was nothing to those six tribulation powerhouses. In fact, when they thought about it, they would feel ashamed. In fact, it was precisely because of this that they dared to help out. If this matter was slightly troublesome to them, they would be worried that the endless tribulations would think that they had participated too much and increased the power of the tribulations. As for why they felt ashamed despite the difference in the flow of time, it was naturally because they clearly knew the difference in the flow of time in the endless world compared to the flow of time in the outside world. It should be known that the flow of time in the endless world was billions of times faster than the flow of time in the outside world. It was even to the extent that one breath in the outside world was equivalent to billions of years in the endless world. Compared to this, what was the difference in the flow of time in a few days that was equivalent to millions of years in the endless world? It didn't even have the value to talk about it. In this way, it was obvious what kind of thoughts they had about this. However, at this moment, many of the fourth tribulation experts who were determined to sacrifice themselves did not pay attention to the flow of time. What they were paying attention to was what was happening to the fourth tribulation expert with unlimited potential. In those millions of years just now, that fourth tribulation expert had charged forward on that path in an indescribable manner, almost leaving behind a trail of dust. Even though the speed at the back was getting slower and slower, that was only in comparison to the speed of the front. Compared to the performance of the previous fourth tribulation expert, it was still much faster. In the end, under this indescribable manner, he reached a height that the fourth tribulation experts could not even imagine. He had completed 99% of that path. That's right, this was only the second time this path had been tried, but this fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential had already forcibly walked through 99% of the path. It could be said that in the end, the other four tribulation experts actually had the feeling that the other party might really be able to walk this path. They even felt that his decisiveness in trying to walk this path was extraordinary decisiveness. It was not as they had originally thought, that it was a waste. It was a pity that the development of the situation was reasonable and disappointing. Although the potential of this fourth tribulation expert was limitless, although he displayed extraordinary abilities on that path, in the end, he was still stuck at 99% of the way. Only the last bit was left. No matter what he did, he could not break through. In the end, he could only helplessly endure the backlash of the endless tribulation of the world. In the end, not only his body and mind, but everything else was completely annihilated by the endless tribulation, or rather, the backlash of the path. Nothing remained. Even his world had been annihilated due to its close connection with it. However, at the last moment, the fourth tribulation expert revealed a smile on his face. The last sentence he left behind was something that the other spectators couldn't understand. So that's how it is, after leaving behind such a sentence, he was completely annihilated into nothingness. His performance naturally shocked the spectating fourth tribulation experts. Of course, at the same time, the other four tribulation experts also felt that it was a pity that he could reach this step. At this moment, how could the other fourth tribulation experts still think that he was extremely decisive? All of them felt that this fourth tribulation expert was too impatient. If he had waited a little longer, if the others had pushed the path a little further, the final result might not be like this at that time. Perhaps what awaited them would already be a completely clear path. What a pity! A fourth tribulation expert sighed. In his expectations, this sigh of his would definitely be echoed by many of his fellow Taoists. Perhaps they would all feel the same way at the same time. Unfortunately, the development of the matter was not as he had expected. When he sighed like this, the surroundings were silent, as if his sigh had not appeared at all. The fourth tribulation expert could not help but be secretly surprised. This development was clearly not right. He hurriedly looked at the others and found that at this moment, everyone's faces were filled with doubt and shock. What's going on? Did something happen? At this moment, no matter how stupid he was, he knew that something unimaginable must have happened. A fourth tribulation expert who was familiar with him said, "Sense the path and see if there's anything different." The fourth tribulation expert frowned and carefully sensed it. In an instant, his expression became the same as that of the other fourth tribulation experts. He became confused and shocked. There was no other reason. At this moment, among the millions of paths that could be chosen, there was one more path. It was a brand new path that had never appeared before, but in essence, it was not inferior to the millions of other paths. What path is this? Why is there suddenly another path? The fourth tribulation expert murmured. This should be his path. At this moment, a fourth tribulation expert seemed to be talking to himself, but also seemed to be responding to him. Hearing this, the fourth tribulation expert's expression was extremely shocked. Suddenly, an inexplicable hope emerged in his eyes. He broke through at the last moment. Now he has fallen into the same fate as the other fifth tribulation experts. If that's the case, doesn't it mean that he can also come back? He exclaimed, but this was what all the other fourth tribulation experts were thinking. That they were talking about was naturally the fourth tribulation expert with unlimited potential. This new path was obviously similar to the one they had heard when they listened to the fourth tribulation expert's description of the cultivation process. If there was any other possibility, they would not believe it. Chapter 3185. Tribulations were just tribulations. No matter how terrifying they were, there would always be a chance of survival. This chance of survival wasn't for certain existences, but for all existences in the tribulations. In other words, it wasn't because one's realm was higher than a certain level that one didn't qualify to enjoy the chance of survival left by the tribulations. It wasn't because one's realm was higher than a certain level that one could enjoy the chance of survival left by the tribulations either. For the tribulations, as long as one was in the tribulations, then one would have a chance of survival, and there would only be a limited amount of it. The situation was the same for the endless tribulations. In other words, those fifth tribulation experts who had disappeared at the beginning of the tribulation and seemed to have been completely devoured by the endless tribulation of heaven and earth were actually not completely devoured. They still had a chance of survival. Under certain conditions, they could still return to this world. Those who had transcended were extremely clear about this point. Even the supreme transcendents who hadn't reached the tribulation realm were the same. After all, although such supreme transcendents were extremely weak existences in the group of supreme transcendents, there were still existences that could stand out from the countless cultivators of a certain world. It was hard to imagine how many dangers they had experienced in the process of growing up. In this way, how could they, who were able to transcend the world, be simple? Even the seemingly simple transcendent transcendents were only relative to other transcendent transcendents. Compared to the vast majority of other cultivators, they absolutely had the upper hand. Their understanding of cultivation, their understanding of experts, and even their understanding of tribulations was clearly something that ordinary cultivators couldn't compare to. For example, the fact that there was a chance of survival in the tribulations was already common knowledge to them. Even the supreme transcendents who didn't immediately realize this was only because they hadn't thought about it. It wasn't that they hadn't thought about it. This was something that even a transcendent being could figure out as long as he was willing to think about it. For those experts who had undergone the fourth tribulation, This was the common sense of common sense. Therefore, at this time, they had an inexplicable expectation that the fourth tribulation expert with limitless potential would fall into the same fate as the fifth tribulation experts. They hoped that the fourth tribulation expert would be able to escape the fate of destruction that they had seen, even if his world seemed to have been destroyed. After secretly anticipating in their hearts for a while, they gradually returned to their senses and began to carefully consider how this new path would affect their plans. He has already reached 99% of that path. In other words, his own path has already crossed 99% of the distance between the fifth tribulation and the sixth tribulation. In that case, if I choose this path, will I be able to reach the end easily? This was the thought that appeared in the minds of the four tribulation cultivators. As soon as this idea appeared, they couldn't help but be tempted. It should be noted that the fourth tribulation cultivator with limitless potential had described every bit of his comprehension, every bit of improvement, and every bit of transformation in detail during his cultivation. Among them, no matter how low the comprehension ability was, they could easily follow the cultivation process and reach a certain depth on that path. If his luck was good and his body was compatible with that path, he might even be able to directly obtain the final sublimation and directly walk that path. With such a temptation, how could they not be tempted? It was better to take action than to be tempted. Immediately, a fourth tribulation cultivator came forward and announced, "I will try this path. I feel that this path is very compatible with me." After all, those fourth tribulation cultivators weren't just symbols. Although in this secret realm, their numbers weren't much different from a symbol, they were existences with their own independent thoughts, their own perspectives, and their own interests. To them, although they were willing to sacrifice for the greater good and help the endless world survive this endless tribulation, it didn't mean that they were completely puppets that completely followed the will of the group. In their hearts, they were actually also yearning for the method that would give them the highest chance of survival. Before this method could only be used to modify the path to the greatest extent, because although that path wasn't compatible with them enough, there was more room for modification and more experts' wisdom was invested in it. This way, compared to exploring it alone, naturally had a much higher chance of success. However, at this moment, a brand new path that was already 99% completed had appeared, and they even felt that this path was more compatible with them than the previous path. They faintly felt that they would be able to walk through it as long as they set foot on it. How could they give up? The fourth tribulation cultivator in front of them was obviously someone who was inspired by this new path. Of course, he didn't really think that he would be able to walk through this new path. However, compared to the previous path that could be greatly modified, this new path seemed to have a much higher chance of success. And this was clearly enough for him to step on this path without any hesitation. After all, he didn't just represent himself now. He also represented the world behind him that was extremely important to him. He also represented the countless living beings in the world. He also represented the sustenance of his soul. Under such circumstances, as long as he could increase his chance of survival a little, he would choose it without any hesitation. Moreover, he felt that the increase was not small. In fact, there were many fourth tribulation cultivators who felt the same way as him. However, they weren't as decisive as him. At this moment, they were still a little hesitant, which allowed him to stand out. However, many other fourth tribulation cultivators who felt the same way didn't feel disappointed. There were benefits to choosing first, and there were also advantages to choosing later. If he chose first, the advantage was that he could make use of the enlightenment he received from the fourth tribulation powerhouse with boundless potential to the greatest extent. He could try his best to match the mysteries that the fourth tribulation powerhouse with boundless potential had displayed in the process of creating this path. In this way, it was equivalent to receiving the blessing of the fourth tribulation cultivator with boundless potential, and it could be said that they weren't fighting alone. Obviously, this was a benefit that the later selected cultivators didn't have. For the later selected cultivators, because too much time had passed since the fourth tribulation cultivator with boundless potential created this path, Even if they cultivated according to the correct method, it would be impossible to successfully walk the path from the fifth tribulation to the sixth tribulation without hundreds of thousands of years. And hundreds of thousands of years was enough to erase most of the feelings, even for the fourth tribulation cultivators. Once the feelings were erased, the blessing that came from the feelings would naturally disappear. Therefore, for the later selected cultivators, they obviously wouldn't be able to receive the blessing of the path creator. This was the benefit that the earlier selected cultivators could obtain. However, at the same time, it wasn't that the later selected cultivators didn't have any advantages. Although they lost the blessing of the path creator, as the later selected cultivators, they could directly see the entire process of the path being taken by the earlier selected cultivator. From this, they could know where there were obstacles in the path, which places were smooth, which places were easy to make mistakes, which places would cause irreversible consequences, and so on and so forth. Through knowing this, when they stepped onto the path, they would naturally be able to consciously seek benefits and avoid dangers, avoid many mistakes that they might have originally made, and avoid many detours that they originally couldn't avoid. And this could obviously greatly increase their chances of walking the path. From this point of view, the later selected cultivators also had their own advantages. As for who was better between them and the earlier selected cultivators, that was also a matter of opinion. Of course, the later selected cultivators obviously wouldn't all be satisfied with their status as the later selected cultivators. Among them, there would definitely be some who felt that the earlier selected cultivators had a greater advantage. However, even if they felt that way, it had already happened. It was their fault for hesitating earlier. A few days passed in the outside world, but millions of years passed in the secret realm. Reality proved that the feeling that the fourth tribulation cultivator had before was actually mostly an illusion. He didn't walk that path. In fact, he couldn't even walk to 99% of the path. In the end, he relied on the feeling left behind by the fourth tribulation cultivator with boundless potential and barely managed to walk to 90% of the path. Compared to the normal path, this kind of progress was already very hard to come by. However, compared to his expectations, compared to the other fourth tribulation cultivators' expectations, this progress was really too little. He couldn't even repeat the progress of the founder of the path. So how could they be satisfied? In the end, with a sigh, the earlier selected cultivator suffered the backlash of crossing 90% of the path. His entire body and mind, as well as his own world, directly turned into nothingness in the backlash. Only an empty shell of that world remained. Seeing this scene, many of the fourth tribulation cultivators were extremely silent. After the sacrifice of several fourth tribulation cultivators, they once again truly felt how difficult this wave of tribulations was. And among the later selected cultivators, who knew how many thoughts of choosing the new path had already been dispelled by this time. Obviously, this could also be regarded as an advantage as a later selected cultivator. They had more opportunities to regret. After a while, the atmosphere in the secret realm gradually returned to normal. Although what happened before made many of the fourth tribulation cultivators feel all sorts of inexplicable emotions, this kind of thing was actually developing according to their initial expectations. The reason why they felt their hearts being impacted at this time was because they had too much expectation this time. Under such circumstances, after they calmed down, they naturally got rid of the inexplicable disappointment brought about by their expectations being dashed. After that, one expert after another began to choose the two paths. Because of the sacrifice of the people before them, they were finally able to walk to a certain height on the two paths. Even the worst one could walk to nearly 80% of the path he had chosen. However, no matter how strong a fourth tribulation cultivator was, there was no way for them to truly come into contact with the limit created by the fourth tribulation cultivator with infinite potential, the limit of 99%. At most, a fourth tribulation cultivator would only be able to push one of the paths to 98%. And every failure represented the destruction of the body and mind of a fourth tribulation cultivator. It also represented the complete destruction of the world that was closely connected to the fourth tribulation cultivator. Just like that, only a few years had passed in the outside world, but the number of fourth tribulation cultivators in the secret realm had already decreased by nearly 1,000. In the endless heavens and earth, the number of empty heavens and earth that were left with only a shell had reached thousands. Amidst the continuous sacrifices, an indescribable solemn atmosphere gradually began to spread in the secret realm. Outside the secret realm, in the world created by the endless tribulations of the world, the people who had transcended fell into a deep silence. Every few days, the destruction of a world would be transmitted to their world, and then through the tight connection between their world, it would be transmitted to their hearts. Under such circumstances, even the most heartless person would feel an indescribable emotion in his heart. Every single one of these experts was stronger than them, and they might even be countless times stronger. But now, they were all sacrificing themselves one after another for him and the others. The collapse and destruction of every world represented the complete obliteration of the body and mind of an expert who was many times stronger than them. And every time the body and mind of an expert who was many times stronger than them was completely destroyed, it meant that they had to bear the sacrifice of another expert, and they had to bear the expectations of another expert. Under such circumstances, how could they still watch coldly from the sidelines? It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that they couldn't meet the requirements, many people who had transcended would have also thrown themselves into the secret realm and sacrificed themselves.